Olá, o Instituto Borborema é uma associação sem fins lucrativos de Campina Grande, na Paraíba. Aqui em nosso canal do YouTube já disponibilizamos mais de 500 vídeos gratuitos entre palestras, aulas, lives e entrevistas, com alguns dos melhores professores e intelectuais do Brasil. E a nossa missão aqui no YouTube é de fato ajudar no debate público nacional, é trazer os assuntos mais relevantes com os melhores professores do Brasil. Para que a gente continue a fazer esse trabalho, nós precisamos da sua doação. Seja no nosso site, no link que está aqui na descrição, com a sua doação recorrente, ou no nosso Pix, pixborborema@gmail.com. Isso aqui não é uma propaganda para alavancar absurdamente todos os nossos recursos, mas é de fato um apelo real e verdadeiro que a gente precisa de mais doações do que a gente tem recebido hoje para manter esse nosso conteúdo gratuito aqui no canal no YouTube. Então, se você gosta do nosso trabalho, peço que você faça a sua doação de qualquer valor. Quem puder doar mais, quem puder doar menos, doa menos. O importante é ajudar para que a gente continue esse nosso trabalho. Fique agora com mais um conteúdo gratuito disponível em nosso canal.
And we are recording. So, Mr. Nyquist, thank you very much for coming on our channel. It's a great honor to speak to you. How are you doing?
I've got a little bit of a cold, so if you'll bear with me, I might sneeze once or twice.
Oh no, that's all right. I think sneezing is not a mortal sin anymore, so I think we're good. So, I was, in planning the interview, I knew I had a lot of very interesting things to talk about with you because of all your work. We are going to feature all your books and your websites on the description of the video for people who are interested. But since those subjects are very complex, I would like to take sort of a pedagogical path here and start with some basic things, right? So you talk a lot about about Russia, about what really went on in the Cold War, about how these how global organizations are interfering with domestic politics in countries, etc. But I would like to start with some basic definitions here. So first of all, from what I read of your material, I understand that we cannot grasp the reality of modern day geopolitics if you don't understand the concept of secret service, right? What is a secret service? What is the task of that organization? Because people, if we just use that terminology, what we will find in people's imagination is basically what they learn from James Bond movies, right? That's what they know about KGB, CIA, etc. is from conspiracy theory documentaries, James Bond movies, etc. So if you could start by giving us some definition and some properties of a secret service organization, its goals, its constitution, etc.
Yeah, okay. Special services or secret services, intelligence agencies, they generally consist of two parts: foreign intelligence and counterintelligence. Counterintelligence is the more important part because it's the part that directly fights the enemy intelligence service and prevents the enemy intelligence service from penetrating your intelligence service. Because it turns out that the greatest mission in a war between intelligence services is to penetrate the other service, to get double agents inside of the other service. And that means winning the counterintelligence game. And you have to have good security to prevent your own service from being penetrated. You have to have a process by which you can tell who is loyal and who is disloyal. And you have to have a discipline and a good psychological understanding of human nature. So foreign intelligence is not just intelligence gathering for the Russians, for example. In foreign intelligence for the Russians, 80% of it is disinformation, psychological warfare. It is for what they call perceptions management, manage the other side's perceptions, and to create a false reality, to completely confuse the mind of the enemy. Everything we do in strategy is determined on mental process and information that we receive. If the information is corrupt or our thinking process has been corrupted, we will not be able to have any strategy that makes sense. We will actually be induced to adopt strategies that will destroy our own side. And so because of nuclear weapons, the contest between the communist bloc and the West did not devolve immediately into war. It became this Cold War thing, which was spy versus spy, which was psychological warfare. And the difference between what the Russians call active measures is that they conduct operations to seed the Western press, Western sources of journalism, with false stories. For example, after John F. Kennedy, the president of the U.S., was assassinated, they salted certain Western papers. I think there was an Italian paper and certain American papers about how Kennedy was killed by the CIA or the bankers or the, whatever the conspiracy theories. There were a number of them they put out there to hide the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist who'd lived in the Soviet Union. He had married a Soviet citizen, his wife Marina, and they wanted to make Oswald look like he was a double agent working for the CIA, that the CIA had been responsible. And this is what most people today believe, that the letters CI and A killed President John F. Kennedy, even though Kennedy's brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was actually supervising the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. He was actually, because they were afraid that it was penetrated, and they wanted to go after the double agents, John Kennedy and his brother Bobby. But even Bobby Kennedy's son, Robert Kennedy Jr., repeats this idea that the CIA killed his father. This is how successful it is. It even fooled the family of the murdered men. By the way, Bobby Kennedy was killed by a communist named Saran Saran. So it's very interesting. You never hear that the Kennedy brothers were killed by communists. And you never hear that the Kennedy brothers were anti-communist, very strongly so. So there's an example of an information game. So it's very important to have these disinformation themes and to penetrate the enemy's service. And these are the two areas where the KGB had a better, and the GRU had a better culture, a better intelligence culture, because Russia has always been an empire under the Tsars, going back to Ivan
Just
the Terrible.
for people listening, if you could just break down those acronyms there, KGB and GRU.
Komitet Gosudorstvennoy Bezopasnosti, KGB, the Committee for State Security. That was the main intelligence service. It started out as the Cheka under Felix Dzerzhinsky when the Soviet Union, or right after the Bolshevik Revolution. It's gone through many names. It's been the Cheka, the GPU, the NKVD, the MVD, which it technically is today back MVD, which is Ministry of State Security, because they brought back the ministry and put both the SVR and the FSB under it. So it's technically now MVD, which it was briefly before Stalin's death. It was the MVD, but then it became KGB because they demoted it from a ministry into a committee. But all that organization aside, the Committee for State Security was the secret police, and it developed its counterintelligence, which was its main function, and its foreign intelligence sides. And they have conducted the greatest counterintelligence operations in the history of the world. The first one, at the very beginning of the history of the Cheka, the KGB, was in the 1920s. It was called Operation Trust. And in that operation, they created a controlled pro-monarchist anti-communist organization that was controlled by the communist secret police. And it was called the Trust because they met in a bank in Moscow, a bank which was called the Trust Bank. And so, but it was led by recruited white generals who had been captured and turned to Soviet agents. And then they used it to penetrate the white Russian diaspora abroad in France and Britain. And they convinced everyone that this trust organization had basically penetrated the secret police, the Soviet army, the Soviet government, and that the trust was in effect taking over Russia for the monarchists, and that the Soviet Union was going to be a monarchy again. And nearly all the intelligence services in Europe believed in it in the 1920s. In fact, they believed in it right up until that moment. I think it was 1929, when a member of the trust defected to Finland, under interrogation, admitted that the trust was completely a hoax, and then redefected back and went back to his office in Moscow. They literally wanted to tell everybody that they'd fooled them and demoralize everyone. And they wanted everyone to know that they'd fooled them. And they basically were able to wipe out all the Western agents in Russia or get control of them. And they were able to assassinate 2 white generals. Sidney Riley, the ace of spies, was captured and probably killed or turned in that operation. It was, in its time, the greatest counterintelligence operation in the history of the world. And they went in the late 80s to repeat that operation by creating a liberal, what appeared to be a liberal Soviet leader named Gorbachev, who was going to change the system. And so you had what supposedly was a pro-capitalist, pro-democratic group within the Communist Party Soviet Union who were going to change the system, which ended with Boris Yeltsin. And it's very curious that this whole process was guided by the KGB. Anna Politkovsky, the famous Russian journalist, asked the question in one of her latter books, could the entire August coup and the fall of the Soviet Union have been an operation of the special services? And you see, this is how you this is like disinformation on a massive strategic scale, where psychologically you're messing with the heads of everybody. And it isn't just that they've done it in those 2 instances. They convinced the British MI6, British and CIA intelligence in the late 40s. There was this thing called Operation Wind. They convinced them that the Polish Home Army was still in existence in Poland and was fighting the communists, assassinating communists, blowing up trains, and that Poland was struggling to be free. And we were then started giving support to this operation. And it was totally controlled by the communists. And we found out because they made a ha-ha broadcast and said, we fooled you. But in the operation they began in the late 80s.
So could you just give us a little more detail on the ha-ha
Operation
broadcast?
Wind? Yeah, the ha-ha broadcast. And suddenly they broadcasted who their agents were, and all the agents now they've captured, and that we'd actually sent them golden weapons.
They who? Russian?
The communists, the GRU and KGB in Poland, and the Polish SB, I think it's SBU or SB, Polish intelligence. We basically financed them, thinking we were financing an anti-communist group in Poland. And so it's controlled opposition is an old idea that goes back to the Tsarist times. You look at the Tsarist regimes, how stable it was. You had this this emperor. Well, he was called emperor at one time, but the Tsar of Russia, he was an autocrat. How do you have that? How do you control a society for hundreds of years successfully? You have a secret police. You have controlled opposition. You use these tricks and tactics, which, by the way, go back to ancient China. And the Mongol princes who basically made Moscow into they were basically a puppet state of the Chinese, of the Mongols. Those Mongol princes were trained in China, and they were trained in these arts. To read Sun Tzu and Han Fei Tzu and these other Chinese Machiavellian types. They learned all these techniques for ruling, and it's very Asiatic. And we in the West, believing in freedom and we speak directly and stuff, they look at us and like they're fools. The Americans are fools because the Americans take things at face value. They say what they think. Oh no, a Russian who really is on his game, he doesn't say what he thinks. He speaks elliptically, and if you're his close friend, you know what he means. But he's not giving away what he really thinks. What are you gonna wear your your thoughts on your sleeve for daws to peck at, as Shakespeare says. You know, they don't believe in this. So there's a cultural distinction between the CIA and like MI6 and the KGB. They just have a better, superior culture for deception and spycraft. And when you're raised in a society where you can be put in jail for saying your opinion and your opinion not agreeing with the government, people watch what they say. They got this form of discipline in which they are paying attention to their words. So they naturally make better spies. If you train these people in a foreign language and you send them abroad, they're practiced deceivers in their own country because they have to deceive continuously to survive in their own country. They go to a foreign country, it's just they're just playing the same game. They haven't needed to change or adapt. They just tell a different set of lies. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfectly. And it's interesting that you mentioned the secret police going back to Tsarist times, because I remember when I was reading that book by Carol Quigley called Tragedy and Hope. I remember you, of course, are familiar with Quigley's work, right?
Yeah, I read the book. Yeah.
And there is a passage in it in which he says that something to the effect of, because I read this many years ago, but I remember I was kind of shocked. He said that many of the horrors that we saw in the Soviet Union, they weren't necessarily the product of a change of minds provoked by communism, but rather the way that Russian politics had always worked, combined with new technologies and population growth and etc. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it's interesting. If there is a sort of continuity between what we saw in the Soviet Union and what went before, we could also see some continuity between what went on in the Soviet Union and what we have now in the Russian government. Because with this whole Russian-Ukraine situation, and even going back since people have been waking up to the whole decline of morals, politics, and economy in the West, seeing the Russian regime, seeing the person of Vladimir Putin as sort of a defense, right, a possible alternative or some kind of savior of Western values. But when we understand that there is continuity going back to Tsarist times, communist times, and modern Russia, this could tell us a lot about what we are actually facing. So if you could just comment a little more about the connections between what we saw in terms of the KGB action in Russia and outside Russia and what we have now in the Kremlin.
Yeah, well, the Bolshevik Revolution shouldn't be downplayed at all. The Okhrana, which was the Tsar's secret police, was taken over by the communists. So many Okhrana officers and agents just simply said they converted to Bolshevism. They wanted to keep their jobs. And they inherited all the files and methods and the training. Of course, eventually Stalin, got rid of anyone that was the old Tsarist type. They ended up, but they learned from them. They took the organization's bag of tricks, controlled opposition, for example, agent provocateurs. The Russians were very familiar. The Russian communists were very familiar with this because they were fighting the Tsar, and in some extent also people adapt the tactics of the people they fight against. So remember that Lenin had declared in What Is to Be Done that he wanted to form a conspiratorial political party. So the Bolshevik Party was conceived as a conspiratorial revolutionary party. And by conspiracy, he meant using of these kind of clandestine methods. Now, he was penetrated by the Okhrana. He was even fooled by some of the Okhrana agents online. There's even stories that there is some evidence that Stalin might have been an Okhrana agent. They got covered up. But, of course, who knows what he pretended to who. But this game that goes on, this double game, is very familiar to the Russian political mind, because in Russia there was no elections under the Tsar, and under the communists, the elections were meaningless. So it wasn't a democratic process. So it had to be a process of another type of struggle. What Bolshevism, the Tsarist regime was Christian. It was Orthodox Christian. And they had these very the notions of good and evil that are carried on in Christianity. So they had limits to what they would do with this kind of agency. And if you read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the policeman who is working on Raskolnikov, the criminal who kills the old pawnbroker lady with an axe, you realize that this policeman is coming from a kind of Christian point of view. He wants to redeem the soul of the criminal.
Mhm.
You know, he's aiming for that. The Tsarist regime, that's why they didn't have a death penalty, except for really horrible things. They didn't like the death penalty in Tsarist Russia. But in the Bolshevik regime, human life, because they had no Christian perspective, human life came to mean nothing. And so suddenly this bag of tricks was then amplified that they had inherited from the Okhrana by being controlled by people who were completely inhuman in their view of man. They had a communist view. And it was all about, not about the individual or the soul. It was about transforming society in this dialectical sense, that man was going to return to being from primitive communism, he was going to evolve dialectically all the way up to advanced communism, technologically advanced. And then there was going to be this utopia or this better world. But really, the inventor of communism, Karl Marx, he didn't really believe in it. He did it as a swindle. He wanted power. And there is always this element in communist leaders. Lenin, who seemed to believe in it, also was power hungry. And Stalin definitely was. And they saw it as a vehicle for accumulation of power. And in a sense, Marxism can be reduced to a formula where man becomes God, or the Vanguard Party becomes God, or the dictator in charge of the Vanguard Party becomes God, because he's directing the process of history, or he's the midwife to history. And so it's very corrupting. And so they acquired all these tools, these Asiatic, a lot of them you could say are Chinese tools. They're from ancient China. China had the most ancient traditions of spycraft and double agency. The first recorded false defector in history is 1900 BC in ancient China. So this goes back very far. You had the different kings in the warring states, and they would send agents out to penetrate the other kingdoms, to bring them down. And the great heroes in Chinese history aren't generals, they're spies. And the Russians picked this up, and the communists. This is why communism naturally found a home in Russia and China. And of course, so damaging to Russia because it destroyed the Christian culture of Russia and brought it down. So what you have with Putin is you have a KGB officer, a colonel, lieutenant colonel in the KGB, who became the head of the FSB in 1998, and who used it to make himself prime minister, make himself indispensable to the system. And one of the first things he did was he would wear a cross. When he first became president of Russia, he put on this cross. And he pretended like he was an Orthodox Christian, and he would hang out with priests. But when he was on the Larry King show, the first time he appeared in the American media was after the sinking of the submarine, the Kursk. And he was on Larry King. He was at some UN meeting. And Larry King said, well, what about this cross you're wearing? And he tells the story about how his dacha burned and the cross survived, and it's like a miracle. And his mother had given him this cross, this quaint story. And then Larry King tries to get him to make a confession of his Christian faith. But Putin won't do it. He won't give a confession because, of course, he's not a Christian. And so finally, Larry King gets exasperated. Well, what do you believe in? And Putin says, I believe in the power of man. This was in 2001. I think it was October of 2001. And I think the Kursk sank in late August. But I believe in the power of man as a communist answer. And when he has made appearances in the Russian media, pretending to be a Christian or whatever, when he mentions Christian ideas, he always frames it in that, well, Leninism is just out of the New Testament. It's just right out of the Bible. Communism is just Christianity, which, by the way, is what Mao Zedong and his people were saying in Yan'an when they were just part of China and they were trying to take over China. This is what they would tell American visitors. Well, we believe the same thing as your New Testament. Our communism is the same thing that's in your New Testament.
And then
This
you
is
have
an old
liberation
line.
theology just as an extension of that.
Right. And so the Russian Orthodox Church has been controlled by the KGB since Stalin reestablished the church during World War II, during the Great Patriotic War. Notice Stalin, the communist, adopts patriotism. He becomes a nationalist. See, they learned a lot from Hitler, because Hitler had said, the problem with Marxism is nobody really believes in it. Only a few intellectuals understand it. So you have to use nationalism. So Hitler invented National Socialism, and he borrowed a lot of ideas from the Marxists, and he created his own form of totalitarianism. Well, it became that during the war. But both the communist Chinese with their great Han nationalism and the Russians with Novorossiya project, they've basically copied this. They've taken a page out of the nationalist book, and they need, you notice the nationalist message gets increased the closer you get to where they're waging war. So China looks like it's engaged in the biggest military buildup in the history of the world, and they're becoming more nationalistic sounding to their people. And Russia builds this up from 2014 to the present, builds up this nationalist rhetoric. When the Euromaidan revolution happens, it's like they just hit the gas on that, and they just absolutely push it. And then they're going to the biggest war in Europe since 1945, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. And it's large-scale conventional warfare, all out. So you see how many complicated elements there is. You're getting people to believe that you believe things you don't believe. So Putin is, someone like Patrick Buchanan thinks Putin is a Christian and a nationalist. But Putin is not a Christian, he's a murderer. And he has murdered at least 82 journalists in the former Soviet Union, including Paul Klebnikov, who was gunned down on a Moscow street when he realized he'd made a mistake in his earlier works and was trying to figure out what was really going on in Russia. People like Anna Politkovskaya, and also dissidents like Alexander Litvinenko was killed with radioactive polonium in 2006. I mean, a guy who orders the assassination of journalists, and it's absolutely certain that he does this, and his political opposition, the poisoning of Navalny, the shooting down of the other opposition politician right outside the Kremlin wall in 2013. He's a murderer. He's not a Christian. Christians aren't murderers. They're not assassins. And he's a liar, because you can basically, you just follow him closely, and it's like, whoa, he lied. And they're very clever lies. And then, is he a nationalist? Is he a Russian nationalist? No, because he's a fake nationalist. In fact, Russian nationalists, the real Russian nationalists, hate Putin. And a lot of them are exiled from him. Because why? Because he brings in Central Asian labor into Moscow to overwhelm Russian labor. They were building, several years ago, the biggest mosque in the world was being built in Moscow. Putin says, I'm the biggest friend of Islam in the world. I'm one of your best friends, he will say. You'll catch him saying things like that. So his Orthodox Christianity is a pose. In 2017, for example, in Sochi, on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, October of 2017, he spoke before the World Festival of Youth and Students, which is a large international communist youth organization. They met at Sochi. He made the introductory speech, and he said, you are the future. I'm behind you. We're behind you. We believe in you, to communist youth. If he was a Christian nationalist, he couldn't be supporting Bolshevik youth, communist youth, which organization, by the way, I think it was last year, they met in Beijing. They had their big deal in Beijing. And so what people have to understand is that Klaus Schwab, with the Lenin on his bookshelf behind him in one of his interviews, who says that the Chinese system is the right system. Klaus Schwab is, and the World Economic Forum is a communist front. And so they set up all these under false names. They set up all these organizations. The Russian Federation is a giant false front. It's the Russian Soviet Federated Republic. It's just got a false thing on the front of it. And the fact that, a lot of Putin's closest people like, Igor Sechin and Patrushev, I mean, they're communists. They even privately have admitted that that's what they believe in. So, and when they were basically tyrannizing Ukraine, it was the Party of Regions and the Communist Party of Ukraine that was holding down Ukraine for Russia, because Ukraine was just a Soviet republic. The Ukrainian blogger Boris Chikole wrote a study about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now, about how all the leading institutions of Ukraine were filled with people trained in KGB academies. And he did a study. He took the biographies of something like several hundred of the leading people in Ukraine, and they had been trained in KGB academies. And this was 10 years ago. The Euromaidan revolution broke that hold of the KGB and the Communist Party underground in Ukraine. And that's why Ukraine is being invaded. They're trying to reestablish the hold of the party and the KGB over Ukraine. Same reason they invaded Georgia in 2008. They'd lost control of it.
Right. Now, you've been, in your articles and in your books, you talk extensively about the reach that the KGB was able to pull off, right, in the world, how the immensity and the complexity of the operation is just absolutely overwhelming. Now, relating to that, there are two things I'm curious about. First, if you could give us sort of an idea of how the balance, or rather the imbalance of power works in relation to the CIA. So we have the KGB pulling all of this off, and then what is the reach, what are the capabilities, the investments, and the real power that the CIA has had throughout the history of the second half of the 20th century during the Cold War, and now. And then the second part I'll ask later.
All right. Well, here's just a simple one. By last count, the estimated number of employees by the CIA is about 21,000 employees. In the former Soviet Union, it was 1 million. And of course, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, you have to now judge by the independent republics. But you can be sure that the number, well, it's going to be smaller, even if it was half, because Russia is about half of the size of the former Soviet Union in terms of population, and you would still have 500,000 KGB, FSB, and SVR officers and employees. How does an organization, it's at least 500,000 people, how much stronger is it than an organization with 21,000? You see the difference. The difference is in size. So you have an organization that's not just 10 times bigger than the CIA, 20 to 40 times bigger. And that's just one dimension. I mean, in the number of agents they can recruit, John Barron estimated that the KGB and its sister services had, 50 to 80,000 agents in the United States. Not intelligence officers, but agents. You look at all the front groups, all the fellow travelers, all the organizations that are under influence of their, where they don't really have to micromanage anyone. They just brainwash people with certain messages. The degree of influence and control that they have exerted is astronomical. It's incredible because they have such brilliant strategies and they have such effective active measure operations.
And hasn't this imbalance in terms of strategical capability, has it never come to the attention of American authorities, the military, the government, at some point during the Cold War?
Well, American intelligence agency is not going to admit that it's inferior to the Russians. There was when, for example, the history of the CIA, they discovered early on the CIA was infiltrated by the KGB. They realized they had a problem because you had these Cambridge moles in Great Britain. And the man who who helped warn the Cambridge moles that Western intelligence was onto them was Kim Philby. Kim Philby, when he warned them and allowed them to escape, two of them to escape to the Soviet Union, basically was working as the British intelligence liaison with the CIA. And so Kim Philby was working in Washington, and Kim Philby was the biggest Soviet mole of all. And so here was the biggest Soviet mole of all, and Kim Philby was slated to become the head of MI6, the organization that James Bond is supposedly works for, right? Mm-hmm. So Kim Philby is there working for MI6 as liaison to the CIA, and he's basically using information he gets out of the CIA to tip off these other Soviet moles in Great Britain to escape. And that's sort of how he fell under suspicion. So here this guy was at the hub of, because British and American intelligence were just, after World War II, they were just really connected. And he was at the hub of it all. And he was going to become the head of MI6. I mean, imagine that, a Soviet agent. And of course, Sir Roger Hollis became the head of MI5, and it's, by many intelligence experts, believed that he was a Soviet agent. So they're able to get inside. So what happened is that we had cracked these codes with the help of the Finnish government, and it came to the attention of the FBI that the head of the CIA, General Walter Bedell Smith, was very likely a Soviet agent in 1952, in late 1952. And in early 1953, they asked President-elect Eisenhower, who had worked closely with Bedell Smith in World War II. Bedell Smith was Eisenhower's assistant during the war, when Eisenhower was the commander of the Allied forces in Western Europe. And they asked him to get him out of the CIA, to trick him into resigning as head of the CIA. And then they got rid of his security clearance. But imagine that, the head of the CIA. Now, the man who was his deputy was Allen Dulles, who took over the CIA. And later, James Angleton said there was something wrong with Dulles. Dulles had taken Nazi gold during the war, and the Soviets knew about it and blackmailed him and his buddies.
Oh my God.
So you got the CIA is the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They did all these things that were mistakes. They went after the Indonesian government, for example, trying to make a coup against it under the misunderstanding that the Indonesian government was communist when it wasn't. They did all kinds of stupid, silly things. There's a book called Legacy of Ashes where they had declassified all this embarrassing history of the CIA's blunders. It's just the only thing they did right was put the Shah in power in Iran. That was just about the only thing they ever did right. And they undid that. By 1978, that was all undone. But the CIA was infiltrated. And this is what the Bay of Pigs, this big fiasco in 1961, that the Kennedy brothers are going, what's wrong with the CIA? What's going on there? And so what do we find out is Angleton, using a KGB defector named Golitsyn, who said, look, you're all loaded up with moles. Angleton started looking for moles along with Bobby Kennedy, and later was looking for them with others. And all they said is, well, he just disrupted the CIA by looking for moles. He just created all this suspicion for nothing. Well, then it turns out at the end of the Cold War, we find out that Aldrich Ames, who was in charge of watching the Russians for the Soviet division, so he's like the top Russia guy, was a Russian agent, right? And the guy that's doing that same job for the FBI, Robert Hansen, was a Russian agent from like 1978. For more than 20 years, Hansen spied for them and didn't get caught. And he was a conservative, right? Who had some funny thing against his own father. So now in the whole history of this, we cannot find any penetrations at that level in the GRU or the KGB that we can show are actually real. When you go to some of these spies like Top Hat, there's a lot of it's equivocal. It looks like he was feeding us false information for some period of time, that they reacquired him. Because they are inside the CIA, they find out who our agents are in their country. So they immediately flip them back. It was found at the end of the Cold War that we had operations against communist Cuba, right? And against East Germany. It came out later that every single one of our agents in Cuba were double agents. Every one of the spies that we thought we had penetrated Cuba were double agents feeding false information back to us. And the same thing in East Germany that had Marcus Wolf. East Germany.
But because they were under Soviet control before that, or they had been corrupted later?
Some of them probably went in and were recruited and were legitimate, but the communists find out about them immediately and flip them. So as soon as you acquire an agent in Cuba or Germany, it would immediately be either arrested or turned into a double agent. And of course, in those societies, if we say we caught you, you're going to be a double agent because you're going to be tortured to death if you're not going to go along. So you're going to go along. So literally, we were being fed. Now, I would suggest that in Russia, it's the same. If little Cuba and little East Germany can have this kind of record, my guess that Russia had that kind of record during the Cold War. Now, their record seems to be not as good recently as it was before. I think there's been a breakdown of discipline in Russia. The system has become so corrupt, but they really knew what they were doing back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They really had it together. And they ran circles around us. And the Chinese, I talked to former KGB officer and a GRU officer that worked with the Chinese, and they said the Chinese are as good or almost as good as we are. So the Chinese intelligence service, which is more numerous, it has its sloppy, not as well trained people because it has so many numbers. I mean, if you think the KGB had huge numbers over the CIA, the Chinese just are way more in terms of numbers than the KGB even. They've got, the number of the Chinese diaspora is huge. And you can't imagine, they're everywhere. They're in our scientific labs, they're in our government, they're in our business community. And Brazil, you got Chinese running all over Brazil right now. All over Latin America, the Chinese are pushing their influence. And this is it's all very serious because they will murder people who get in their way, and they will lie, cheat, and steal. And it's all highly organized, just like organized crime. Only it's political organized crime with a strategic end in mind.
Yeah. Now, one question I meant to ask you when I was preparing the interview, and I think you sort of started to answer it, but maybe you have some more things to say about that. But when I started to look into the whole history of the KGB and the influence it has had in the history of the West, one thing that sort of raised my curiosity was that when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, Russia had not only suffered with the war, right, but it also was kind of a backward country, right? It did not undergo, it hadn't undergone such an intense industrial revolution such as England or France had done. And so you have a country who's at war, who has a lot of, certainly a lot of economic problems, and does not have the whole industrial apparatus as Western countries. At least that's the history that I've heard about. How did they pull it off? How were they able to get this massive operation going with apparently scarce resources?
You mean the Bolshevik regime?
Yeah, because that's where the KGB comes from, right?
Yes, it is the sword and shield of the Communist Party, Soviet Union. Look, if you look at Russian industrialization, when Marx wanted to make a revolution in Germany in 1848, Russia was at least as industrialized as in 1917 as Germany was in 1948. You know, I mean, to some extent, I mean, Russia was developing industries. Russia had railroads and railroad locomotives. They weren't in the Middle Ages. They had a modern army. Russia was just 30 years behind Europe in its development. And it was a place people were, like the French, were heavily invested in. The French were building up the Russian railroads. There was all kinds of investment in Russia. But it was in that period where the labor wasn't treated very well, where labor unrest was a real reality, where there was great poverty. Just like there was great poverty in the 1840s in Europe, that the revolutions of 1848 swept over Europe. Russia was more in that state. So, and yes, of course, most people in the United States, the greatest industrialized country in the world, when my grandparents were born around 1900, most people were born on farms in the United States. So 2/3 under the Soviet Union, the general rule was 2/3 of the population was engaged in farming. They were rural. The Soviet Union did contribute to that industrialization, but Russia was a country largely of peasants. And what Lenin did very simply was he said, well, we'll give you the land. He promised the peasants bread and peace. That was Lenin's slogan when he took over the country. And you say, well, that's not a Bolshevik slogan, bread and peace. Well, Lenin was a practical politician. See, when you're interested in war, people forget Marxism is very flexible. So that Marxists can engage in capitalism. They can engage in nationalism. They can engage in all kinds of activities. They're not restricted to just being doctrinaire Marxists. In fact, Lenin spoke against that. He wrote an essay on left-wing communism and infantile disorder, he called it. You're going to be some doctrinaire Marxist, you're an idiot. You have to be flexible. You have to be realistic. He says there is no Marxist dogma. Marxism is the scientific management of human affairs. So we're not the super industrialized country. So Lenin promised bread and peace. So under the Soviet Union, at the beginning, the farmers all got their own land. Peasants got their own land. It was 9 years later, after NEP was closed by Stalin, that they took the land away and they did farm collectivization. And see, what Lenin did is Lenin basically murdered Kamenev and Zinoviev and pushed Trotsky into exile because they wanted to collectivize farming right away. And Lenin had taught Stalin right. And Stalin said, no, we have to do this. The country will crumble. So what they did is they went with, the NEP was capitalism. Lenin said, we cannot form Russia we don't know how to make a communist economy, so we have to retreat into capitalism, into state capitalism. And they did that. Gorbachev did that in the 80s. So they built the Soviet Union on a free market farming for most of the economy, where people own their own prop businesses. Most people in the Soviet Union in 1925 owned their own businesses. That was NEP, New Economic Policy. That was Lenin. That was Stalin. And when Stalin went in 1929, he made a speech in Siberia. Siberia was going to be the first place they collectivized the farmland, as there was less there. It was a cold place. And he made a speech and he said, this is what we're going to do. And he said, all these people, they thought, well, we weren't communists. This is a mistake. We're communists. We were always going to collectivize the land. It's just they couldn't win the country over and build the country up unless they started from a capitalist base, from a free market base. And so that's what they did. So if you want to know what the Soviet Union was built on, it was built on capitalism. And even the Stalin command economy was a state capitalist system. And you find it even in their own literature, they admit this. So it was a kind of mercantilism. And so, see, so many people think when they talk about communism, they imagine communism as an economic system. And they think about Marx writing a book called Capital. It's all nonsense. It's not an economic system. It's a system of power and control. They know perfectly well that there is no communist system, economic system. Well, there is, but you're in the Stone Age the minute you practice it, because you must have a medium of exchange and you must have some kind of market. Soviet Union has always had a market. When the Soviet Union didn't have a market was in 1918, when initially Lenin tried communism in 1918. And they basically eliminated a lot of the money transactions. They got rid of the stock exchanges. They got rid of everything like that. And you know what happened in the country? And this is in Chamberlain's history, the 2-volume history of the Russian Revolution. They had like 2 or 3 railroad locomotives in the whole of the Russian Empire that were functioning after several months of that, of trying to practice communism. The whole economy collapsed when they tried to practice communism. Just collapsed. They couldn't make it work. And that caused the Civil War. That opened the door to the whites coming back in the Russian Civil War, which almost destroyed the Bolsheviks. So they learned by very hard experience that you can't just like in Brazil, in the country you're saying, well, the communists control everything. Why don't they just murder everybody and establish their perfect because the whole thing will collapse and they'll be hung. They'll be right back at the Russian Civil War with the whites coming back into the country and they're fighting for their lives. So they understand. They've learned from their own history and they're pragmatic. And that's what people in the West, they've got a cartoon idea of Marxism, some academic professor telling them what Marxism is. And it's like, Lenin wasn't an academic. Marx was trained as an academic, but they wanted to do this for real. They were interested in power. They were interested in controlling the destiny of mankind, So for Marx would say, well, it's understanding is not the important thing. It's the actual doing. That's what matters.
Yeah, and this understanding of communism mainly as a political system, as the ideal of political system, perhaps that's the greatest difficulty that it causes the greatest difficulty in understanding the history behind modern Russia and the modern communist movement, because it sounds crazy to most people.
It
right?
is crazy.
Yeah.
It doesn't just sound crazy. It is crazy.
Yeah. And so you have already spoken about that, but just if you could formulate that in a more incisive way for people now who think that the regime we have now in the Kremlin that has invaded Ukraine, that it does not have a connection, any sort of connection with the Soviet regime. What's the politics of Russia looked like before the supposed fall of the Soviet Union. Now, if you could just trace that, right? So what happens in what we understand as the fall of the Soviet Union, and how does that connect to modern Russian politics?
Okay, the Soviet system, which was the neo-Stalinist Brezhnev system, how it evolved was economically, it was actually a mercantilist state capitalism. And it wasn't working very well. It had some problems. But in terms of competing with the West, it wasn't working well. It wasn't adaptive enough. It couldn't integrate innovation. It couldn't come up with innovation. So how are they going to do this? They had conceived of a strategy in the late 50s of doing a super NEP, copying what Lenin and Stalin had done in the 1920s, and doing a super NEP, and having a liberalization of the Soviet Union that would be for outward consumption. They would have elements of genuine liberalization, but it would be controlled. The KGB and its allies within the party structures, even though the party was going to go away, they would still be controlling everything. They would control the media still. They would control the banking. They would control the major companies, the big businesses. And they would let people, like they did in the 1920s, own their own businesses. They were going to allow this. In fact, under Gorbachev, some people have said, some Russians, I've heard them say that there was more freedom in the last couple of years of Gorbachev than under Yeltsin or under Putin to do things. So they were going to privatize a lot of this. But what they did to make sure that the privatization was false is they created these oligarchs. And this is something that former KGB officers and people in Russia that I've talked to who know the stories, people like, well, Konstantin Preobrazhensky, the former KGB official, told me that Boris Berezovsky, the famous oligarch who supposedly put Putin into power, he became a Russian billionaire by signing a contract with the KGB. Here, you sign on the line, we'll make you a billionaire, now you go be the billionaire. Because they had to create, in order to seem like they were a capitalist country, capitalist countries are operated by billionaires and millionaires. So they had to create this class out of whole cloth. So in fact, there was a contact I had in Moscow who knew how Mikhail Khodorkovsky got to be in charge of Yukos Oil, is that he was a second secretary of Komsomol, that's like the Soviet Boy Scouts, in some town in the Soviet Union outside of Moscow. And they said, well, some Western investors came looking at the Russian oil, and they said, well, only if you had a nice Jewish boy in charge of this. Well, isn't there a nice Jewish boy in as second secretary of this Komsomol? They signed him up to become a billionaire. These are the stories of the oligarchs. The oligarchs were people recruited by the party and the KGB to be the billionaires, to be the face of Russian capitalism, of Ukrainian capitalism. And the interesting thing was that this experiment, this NEP, carried with it the danger that many of these oligarchs would, of course, they would have real power, and they would go against their masters, which is what happened. You have Guzinski and Boris Berezovsky. They've murdered, since this war began, a number of oligarchs have been murdered. And they murder them and they take the property back to the state, or they give it to another oligarch. And it's just a front for the Soviet mercantilist system. It's a license. Okay, I'm giving you a license to be a billionaire. It's like what Miles Guo has said about Chinese billionaires. He said Chinese billionaires only end up one of two ways. Miles Guo is a Chinese billionaire who defected to the U.S. He said they either end up dead or in jail in the long run. Well, that's what happens to communists in a communist system to a billionaire. He's going to end up dead or in jail because it's a scam. He's only up there for appearance's sake, and if it looks too real, he's going to be brought back. So this is what they did. They transformed the system, and it opened it up. The small middle class began in both Russia and Ukraine and other, where people own their own businesses. And this was a problem because it's caused Euromaidan revolution. Just like Marx and Lenin would have said, Stalin would have said, you don't allow the bourgeoisie, you don't allow people to own their own businesses, they'll overthrow your system. Stalin wrote in his Fundamentals of Leninism that the biggest enemy that the communist system has is the small business owner. It doesn't matter that he doesn't have any money. It's that what he has is his own, and he'll fight for it. And he's more numerous. He says the big capitalists are easy to control. You can scare them. You can threaten them with death. You can do, and here's one guy, he controls billions. Good, we can control him. But a million small proprietors? This is where you get a civil war from. This is where you get the Euromaidan revolution. This is what these crowds in Moscow that Putin was having beat up by the police and thrown in jail in 2012 when he went again to be president of Russia after being prime minister. So they evolved their system away from the Brezhnevite version of the Soviet system, and they allowed this capitalism to exist, this small proprietor capitalism. But like right now in Russia, what I'm hearing is this war is moving them closer to the war communism, back towards the Brezhnevite system, because the small businesses are failing across Russia right now. And that just makes the center more powerful. The more centralized the economy, you don't eat, you don't have a job, we control everything. That, they sort of made a deal with the Russian people. They said, look, as long as you don't get involved in politics, own your own business, do whatever, just don't get involved in politics. And that was the same thing with the oligarchs. If you get involved in politics, follow the program that we've given. Putin sat all the oligarchs down when he became president, and he said, now this is the new order. You're going to follow what I say. And that's very important to understand. And it's just like in Brazil, in Sao Paulo Forum, taking over all these countries in Latin America. You see Brazil, the stages, you see what they did, what the Workers' Party has done in Brazil, and how horrible it was for them that they lost power to Bolsonaro for 4 years. But look at how they just went to grab it back so ruthlessly. And now it seems like they're really in a hurry to get to the more totalitarian level.
Yeah.
Right? They want to take away your freedom of speech and say, if you say certain things, it's fake news.
Yeah. No, that seems to be top priority right now.
Right. Because
and if it does work, it's going to be a complete disaster.
Yeah, because your ability to speak freely is what caused them to lose power in that one window where their whole thing was derailed.
Yeah.
So it's the totalitarian disguise, you could say. The fall of the Soviet Union was the totalitarian disguise. And the problem with the disguise for countries like Poland and East Germany and Romania and Hungary is that in some of those countries, the disguise didn't work. So in Poland, by 2007, you've got them discovering Russian agents in working the political parties in Poland. They're working out of the Polish Defense Ministry. It's the GRU using Polish military intelligence to control the political process in Poland, and they outed it. So then their control of Poland started to unravel. Their control of Romania has been iffy, partially unraveled. Their control in the Baltic states and in Georgia unraveled. And Ukraine completely exploded, right? So the communists could not, with this disguise, they couldn't keep power everywhere. But they kept it in the key, in Soviet Central Asia, in Russia, and Azerbaijan, in Armenia. They play those two against each other to keep them under their thumb. So they had problems. It's not as Gorbachev said, we're entering into a period of great struggle. Because in order to debate, and what was the advantage that they got out of it? They give up all these positions in Eastern Europe. They get all these people turned against them. They get a revolution in Ukraine. They get people into Brazil to take control of Brazil, Venezuela, Chile, Peru. And Washington. They can then more easily, under this arrangement, because people don't think there's a threat from Russia and or China, they're able to infiltrate the West and get control of certain countries to get a level of degree of control in Canada and Mexico and Brazil that they couldn't ever imagine if there was a condition of Cold War ongoing. And so this was the genius of the strategy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they screwed up their system. They had it all. They planned it for years. They screwed it up so bad they almost really collapsed. And right now they're in a civil war because it screwed up so badly in Ukraine in 2014. Because it was all supposed to be able to where they could seamlessly put the empire back together again. But this is where communist harebrained scheming, when you think of all these strategies, the rule in strategy is no strategy survives contact with the enemy. So they don't always work out right. And in Brazil, you saw the mistakes they made in Brazil that caused the Brazilian people to turn against them. Now they're pushing really hard. how long is this? How pushing as hard as they are? How long before there's a big reaction in Brazil finally, or will Brazil, the people of Brazil, just allow themselves to be cooked slowly in the socialist pot? You don't know.
Yeah, up to this point, I don't even see what a big reaction would be. You know, like after all that has happened, I don't really see any effective action on the population.
Well, I know that in Ukraine, people were pretty despairing after Yanukovych ended up getting elected in 2010. They thought, well, we're just going to be rolled back into, Boris Chikole said Ukraine could be rolled back into the Soviet Union in a fortnight. And I think he was right at the time. But then this strange revolution happened in 2014. And you'll notice the Russian propaganda now is focused, and the Russian active measures are focused against the right, because the right is the big danger. You had Svoboda in Ukraine, which was the far right, sort of an anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi right. And yeah, there's evidence the Russians controlled that. Even the Azov movement came out of Moscow to Kharkiv, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Controlling the far right and the far left is a strategy of the communists. Mm-hmm. Because the far right, the neo-Nazi right, is actually, the Red-Brown Alliance is actually workable. Because you put the squeeze from both ends on the middle. You eliminate the middle, and then you have what they call convergence of the right and the left. This is what their ultimate strategy is with this strategy. But they need already, the left are a bunch of useful idiots. The left are going to believe whatever they're told. The thing is getting control of the right. So they have to penetrate the right with this idea that Putin is not a communist. Even though Putin, gave 25 million tons of grain to Cuba and they thanked him, almost 2 years back to back. He's building military bases in Nicaragua. He's got troops in Caracas, Venezuela, and is helping all the African communist dictators. And Putin is receiving artillery shells from communist North Korea, and is openly allied with China. He's described as non-communist, even though he's part of this communist bloc. He's integral to it. And you see, don't watch what they say, watch what they do. His actions are louder than his words. His actions are, he's an ally of the communist bloc. He's an integral member of the communist bloc. And Iran is in that bloc because the leading clerics of Iran were educated at Moscow State University. They're Russian agents. This is where the Ayatollah went to college. He went to college in Moscow, where he was almost certainly recruited. So that's why Iran so they have liberation theology Islam in Iran, right? That's what it is, basically, the terrorist liberation theology Islam. And then they have the same thing in Brazil with Sao Paulo Forum and the liberation theology Catholics. And they have adapted it to every region on the earth, to Africa, to Latin America, to Iran and the Muslim world. They've adapted their forms of it's like Mao said, China is, the Chinese Communist Party is Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics. So the Workers' Party is Marxism-Leninism with Brazilian characteristics. So and the Islamist movement in Iran is Marxism-Leninism with Islamic characteristics. But they would never say that openly. Right, they wouldn't say that because they're manipulating. Most of the people are just useful idiots that are manipulated by a larger process, a strategic process, and they can lose control of that process, like they did in Brazil when Bolsonaro got elected, like they have at moments in other countries, like they have in Brazil with the Civil War, because communism is a totally corrupt system, and it usually fails economically and, as we see in Ukraine, militarily. But where it succeeds is in getting everybody to believe these fake narratives that Putin is a nationalist and a Christian and right-wing people need to side with him. And what did Putin say to Lula? He congratulated him on his election. And there's the BRICS alliance, So it's like you can't engage with communists because they will lie and cheat you, and they will steal from you. So you can't engage with them. You just have to keep them at arm's length and hope that you're ready if they come at you with weapons. But you can't open the door and let them in. And because all these deceptions that they engage in, I mean, all these outright lies. I mean, look at the right is been targeted. And they started back, you look at Alex Jones. 9/11 is an inside job, right? This is what he almost lost his career over that when 9/11 happened. He said it's an inside job. This is a Russian propaganda theme that we did 9/11. The CIA killed JFK. The CIA did 9/11. The CIA, you know, they were there in the Garden of Eden with the snake, right? They're going to make it. They're going to make the CIA responsible for it. The CIA is the devil. So, but the reality is very different. The KGB, Stalin said this lawyer I knew, she was a Soviet lawyer. She met Stalin around 1950. Stalin had gone to her school, her law school in Leningrad, and he gave the speech and he said, our enemies will accuse us of all these crimes. So what you do as a Soviet lawyer is you just accuse them of those same crimes. And so you can tell whatever they're accusing other people of doing, you go, oh, they must be doing that. And it turns out they are. They're always committing the crimes that they're accusing. It's like NATO committed aggression. NATO wants to destroy Russia. NATO is planning to invade Russia. And Russia invades Ukraine that never had a plan to invade Russia. And Ukraine isn't even in NATO. And no, Russia's planning, it's like just total projection. That whatever Russia is thinking, it projects that on to its enemy. You know, we want to destroy you, therefore you're trying to destroy us. But they know perfectly well we're not. That Russian paranoia is partly, it's for show. It's an excuse. Well, we have to destroy you because you're plotting against us. It's like this crazy, you know, they tried to kill Putin, you know, with the little firecracker drone that goes over the, you know, goes over the Kremlin and blows up like a little sorry firecracker. I mean, if that's a killer drone, I don't know how drones work. It's ridiculous. But see, this is the propaganda that they put out. And so, and it's just like now, I just was shown this, these Scandinavian journalists, they actually tracked the ship, the Russian Special Operations ship, was over the Nord Stream pipeline before it blew up. And that ship has submarines for going down and planting charges. So now this is coming out. So they blew up the pipeline, and they've got German politicians saying, we need to break with the United States because they blew up the pipeline. You know, because so the Russians, if they can't win the battle because they're so corrupt, they can't win the battle in Ukraine, but they can win the battle by convincing people that America is so evil that Germany will break from the US and stop supporting Ukraine, and the whole front will collapse, and they'll own all of Europe. That's what they're aiming at.
Yeah, if you could give us a little more detail about that, because one thing I have heard from pro-Putin people, which is basically the whole of the Western right at the moment, not the whole of it, but you understand.
A good part of it, yes.
A good part of it, yes. Is that the information we are getting from the Ukraine war, which is, if you take a look at the media vehicles in general, is that Russians are getting smoked, right? That the special military operation is not going as planned. And now many people say that that's just all a bunch of lies, that actually Russia is crushing it. And now, in regards to that, and I'm asking the question so you can comment on it, and then comment on the development of that, which is the situation being as it is. What do you think is actually in their plans right now? Meaning, are they going to carry this war on until they completely dismantle the Ukraine government and take over Ukraine? Are their military operations going to extend after that? What are they aiming at exactly?
Well, some of the people that were brought in to rule the provinces, even before they annexed Luhansk and Donetsk, in the phony voting they had, they had one of the guys that came into Kherson. I think it was in Kherson. He said, "Oh, this is Russia now." This is months before they even said that they were going to turn Ukraine into Russia. They went for a knockout blow when they had invaded. They went for Kiev. They tried to surround Kiev by dropping paratroopers into the airport on the west side of Kiev. They had troops coming from the east and coming from the north. They were going to surround it, and they had a list of top 30 government officials to murder, including Zelensky. And they were going to set up their own puppet government in Kiev. And they were going to reintegrate Ukraine back into the Union. Because Putin had written these essays, written, I think it was in August of 2021, he published an essay in which he basically said the Belarusians and the Ukrainians and the Russians are really one people. And they have always been one people. And they need to be one people again. And so Putin was basically, and this is the scholarly argument, Putin the historian was trying to say that these are going to be one people. So we know from reading the messages what he was doing. He was taking over Ukraine to integrate it with Russia. And then he was going to demand that Belarus, which is in military union with Russia, also come in. So you're going to have a reconstituted union. They're not going to use the word Soviet because that wouldn't be popular. They'll call it something else, some kind of union. And they're going to reconstitute what was essentially the Soviet Union. And I think that was always the plan when they broke up the Soviet Union. Because you can see when they created a Transnistria in Moldova and they created the breakaway areas down in Georgia, they created these opposition movements within the different possible Soviet republics so that they could block them off and hem them in and have an excuse to go in and invade them. Mm. That's why they created these separatist movements in the outlying republics and why they put Azerbaijan and Armenia against each other. So they made it so, in fact, the Russian military has never left Central Asia. Central Asia is still just a giant parking lot for the Russian military. They come and go in there when they want. They control bases there. Those countries don't have real sovereignty. It's still the Soviet Union, basically. It's just it's disguised. It's just a disguised form. So and so this is what they're doing because they've reached this part of their strategy where Russia and China are gaining nuclear superiority, and they are in a position where if they come together and they're stronger, they can basically make demands. And so what is their strategy is they thought they were going to take over. This is very clear from things Putin said. Putin said, we can take Ukraine in 2 weeks. This was promised to Putin. The attack on Kiev failed. They lost too many men. It started out, maybe the first day was good, but then it just started going downhill from there. And they just lost too many men. They got repulsed bloodily. And so they have to win by turning the screws, oil and gas and food, because the gas makes fertilizer. And then to blame the U.S. and to blame NATO. And so, they want to divide NATO up. They want to turn the Germans. They mainly want Germany to break out of NATO and to make a separate treaty with them. And then they would be able to create what they call a new security architecture for Europe. This has been in the mouth of Putin and Medvedev for years. A new security architecture in Europe, which would be Europe with the Americans gone and the Russians dominant everywhere.
Yeah, but this domination wouldn't necessarily have to go through actual military invasion of that.
Well, they hope not. They hope that they can just dominate them without having to do that, because that's painful. And that could lead to what they have in Ukraine. They would rather use their agents. See, most of the Cold War, they controlled the East Bloc countries through agents rather than armies. Mm. They would call the armies, like in the Czech Spring in '68, they invaded it from all sides. And they would call the army in, like in Poland. That was dangerous. They didn't want to do it too much, but they would let the Polish military do that. But they would use armed force sparingly. Hungary, 1956, right? The Soviet army came in and had to crush the Hungarian uprising. They will use the military when they have to, but they want to control it through their agent networks and through their deception operations and controlling politicians. And they have politicians they want to kill and politicians they want to elevate. because these politicians are realists who will work with them, like Macron or like Angela Merkel, right? And so they hope to get control of Europe through this process. And cutting off the natural gas and blaming the Americans for that to win the Germans over, to have the Germans be angry at the Americans. And France is so leftist that they think they can, get France whenever they want. The real problem is Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Finland, the Baltic states. That's their in Scandinavia. That's their and those are the real problem, because those countries know Russia wants to dominate the continent, and they're rearming. Poland is arming, Sweden is arming, Finland is arming. The Baltic states are helping. They're all helping Ukraine, and there's talk of a union between Lithuania and Poland to make an even bigger state that is more capable of resisting the Russians. So this is what the Russians have confronting, that they have to break down in order to win. And this is why Brazil is important and all these other countries are important, because they're winning in all these outlying areas, and they're surrounding the first world. They're surrounding, NATO. They're surrounding America, and they're infiltrating them. And then they can just simply, and if they can collapse our economy and make a civil war in the U.S. or in European countries, they can then start the general world war that will force all these countries, by dire threat or actual invasion, into the new socialist world system that they want to create with China.
Right, but now the Specjalna Wojenna Operacja, right? What they're doing in Ukraine right now, doesn't it make this diplomatic process much more difficult? Because at least that's what we have now. Western media is massively against Russia. Do they have some plan B?
Well, this is the hiccup. This is the hiccup that they got Putin pretending to be right wing made him an enemy of their own left. Now, when you go to the communist parties, they know Putin is a communist, and they're pro-Russia. If you go to the communists, if you go to the far left and the far right, they're all for Russia, and they're against Ukraine. It's very interesting. But it's this big sloshy area of the soft left, which is the people that need to be won over to the truth if the West is to survive, is that the larger 40% of the left can be won over and say, you do want to live, don't you? This is what you're headed for, communism. Do you realize it? You're not going to live in a free country anymore, and you're not going to have anything to eat. Once they understand that, they will flip. But right now, because Putin is really fighting, they have to neutralize the right, because the right can become very powerful, as what happened with Bolsonaro. And to neutralize the right, Putin has to seem like a Christian and a nationalist. And then the bad part is the left goes against him in America and Western Europe. But what they're gaining is that inevitably in many of these countries, the right's going to come to power. And then the right will do the job for them. And then the convergence comes later.
Right. Yeah. Right.
I mean, it doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter, because look at Biden. The humanitarian aid, I just talked to another person. I've heard this from so many sources that there's a volunteer organization that they've been, it's organized by Americans, some of them Republicans. I think George Pataki was involved in it, was one of the leaders in it. They've sent tons of relief. They've sent generators and fuel so the Ukrainians could be warm through the winter. They've done tremendous things. And what do they hear from the Ukrainians? Well, this supposed, $80 billion that they got in humanitarian aid from the U.S., they didn't see hardly any of it. Mainly what they got were from these people doing it volunteer-wise. And I heard the same thing from people at the Pentagon saying, well, we just say we're giving them these things. We're really not, And they were basically, the Pentagon was forced to give them things by being embarrassed by the Polish and the British, kind of forced their hands. So we have given them things, but I don't think it's $100 billion. I think it's more like 30 or 40 billion. and we're dragging our feet. You know, we haven't yet even sent a heavy tank or a fighter plane to Ukraine. I mean, you send them 20 HIMARS, you know, rocket artillery vehicles, and a bunch of light arms. Like we gave them the first $5 billion was in rifles and pistols and ammunition for rifles and pistols. They don't need that. They make their own, right? What they need is heavy weapons. They need artillery. They need tanks. Not a single tank. What is with Washington not sending? Look at Sweden to send tanks. Poland to send tanks. Why is the U.S.? So Biden is not the friend of Ukraine. He just has to provide that image because that's part of the game. Because Trump is a Russian puppet, and they have some kind of plan where all the Russian puppets, all the pro-Russian people, are maybe going to be arrested or sidelined or discredited in some future scenario. It's hard to say how they will play that out.
And when you say Trump is a Russian puppet, you are doing indirect discourse, like that's what the American left thinks, or?
Oh yeah, the American left has been saying Trump is a Russian puppet since 2016. That's what the Russiagate was all about. Trump is a Russian puppet, and the right wing is now becoming a Russian puppet, right in front of our eyes. Tucker Carlson being anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian, Jack Posobiec, Patrick Buchanan. So they can say, look, the right is a tool of Russia. It's a domestic fifth column of Russia. So that creates a situation where Mr. Biden can, if there's a declaration of war or something, where he can intern them all in camps. You're all a threat to the government. We're now at war with Russia, and now you all need to be, because what happens when you declare war? Those who can be called agents of the enemy country or enemy nationals can be all arrested. In World War II, we interned Japanese. We interned some Italians and Germans. The British interned all sympathizers with National Socialism. They were interned at the beginning of the war. So people who sympathize with the Putin's regime, who you can document it, they will be put in camps. And it's like, is that part of the strategy further down the road? I don't know. But if I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, you know what? This looks like they got some idea of doing this in the future. You got to always look, when you read the strategy, when you're reading the moves, you can kind of, again, translate the moves into what it's going to mean. And in Brazil's a kind of different situation than the U.S. because the U.S. is the strategic center. But I think that Mr. Biden is an agent of Russia, because in the Bukovsky documents, he is caught. There's a Central Committee memo in 1979 when Biden was a senator leading a Senate delegation there, saying, I'm really on your side. I just have to speak out against you publicly for my constituents at home, but I'm really your guy, kind of thing, And the fact that he was put into office by Arm & Hammer, a known KGB agent, that he's supported by the Council for a Livable World, which is a KGB or a Communist Front organization. Biden is not an anti-Russian, anti-Chinese. He has been a tool of the communists, just like Barack Obama, just like the Clintons. That's really, the communists don't tattoo a red star on their forehead, just like Lula da Silva and the Workers' Party. We're just social democrats. What are you talking about? What do you see reds under the bed? And so Putin doesn't admit he's a communist. Xi Jinping, we're capitalists now, right? If you listen to these people, there's no communists anywhere in the world. They just don't exist. But of course they do, because what just happened in Venezuela? What just happened in Nicaragua? What is going on in Cuba? What are they doing? Why are communist policies coming into effect everywhere? Why do they want to control everything? My statement is, it's communism stupid, right? It's communism. Just say the C word. Can you pronounce it after me? Communism. Yeah. And of course, the problem is it's a very complicated idea and a very deceptive one. And so it's not, Bukovsky, he was very frustrated. I said, they never understood communism here in the West, did they? He says, no, they never did. And I said, well, why didn't they? Well, it's too complicated for them. They want something like a hamburger, a fast food. They just want to tell me what it is and get it over with. It's like, no, it's a huge explanation, because you have the communist movement, and then you have the communist philosophy, which is very complicated. And then you have the communist organizations and how they work. And you have all their front groups, which are not communist, because most of the communist movement is not communist. It's led by communists, but they're like a shepherd leads sheep. There are all these organizations on the left and now on the right even that are just kind of being manipulated and led by their active measures.
Now, I asked you earlier about the situation in Ukraine, in which Russian forces have been surprised, perhaps, by...
Yes, they were surprised.
Yeah. And but how do you think Chinese military capabilities fit into this? Do you think they also have some surprises coming to them? If they do they have plans of actual military incisive action in the near future?
Yes, I think they do, but they've been greatly sobered by the Russian problems. The military system of China and Russia needs to have a nuclear component. Conventional war, for them, is not going to work because the whole global system will cut them off from their trade, and their economies won't be able to breathe. So if they start a conventional war, and they understand this. So why should they invest their money in having these tremendous conventional forces that are as good as the American, right? Conventional weapons. It would be inordinate expense for nothing because their conventional militaries, what if China occupied the Philippines and Taiwan or took over Thailand? What would that get them? They would just be blockaded. They would end up crumbling. They wouldn't be able to feed themselves. It would be hopeless. If Taiwan was captured by China, China would be punished so bad the regime might not survive. So in order to break out, and this is what the Chinese strategists say, is that why should we fight? Why should we take Taiwan? Why should we take any country over? The Americans will be against us. We're going to have to contend with the Americans. So let's just go straight to America and wipe out America first. Then the other countries will just fall into our lap. Because if America disappeared tomorrow, no country could stand against China, conventionally or especially in nuclear terms. So China would just be able to use its nuclear weapons to do what America did to Japan in 1945, is saying, we're going to hit this city and this city. Now do you surrender? All right, we'll hit another city with a nuke. Okay, now you surrender. Okay, now we're sending the people to govern your country. We're going to pick your government. We're going to have a communist government there. That's how you do it. So the Chinese have this conception of defeating the United States first, which means a surprise Pearl Harbor type strike on the U.S. strategic missiles and the U.S. Navy, so that they cripple America strategically, and then they can force America to its knees, basically force it to surrender. This is the way the Soviet military was constructed too, was they trained, as Colonel Stanislav Lunev, the defector, said, we trained for one mission only, nuclear world war against America. And nuclear world war is not just, you just don't fire nuclear weapons, you send your armies in and your navies in, and you take all the territory. You know, and the countries that you don't invade, they just know better and they just flip over to your side. And what the Russians really want is just Europe to flip without having a war. That's what they really want. They want Europe to flip. They want Japan to flip, South Korea to flip, Australia to flip. They got India already is in their camp. So they just want them to flip. So the only country they have to defeat and destroy is America. The rest just they own. So how do you defeat America? Well, the big mistake was they thought, this is the proof that they thought they could take Ukraine in 2 weeks. They would have never gone in for a long war in Ukraine because it's screwed up. They want to destroy the U.S. And so how do they destroy it? Biological attack, subversion, cause a civil war in America, get Americans. See, infiltrating the right's very important because they have to get the right and the conservatives so angry with the crazy left that there's an actual fighting between the left and the right. They have to get this fighting between the left and the right, because that is so key. Because if America collapses into a civil war and its economy collapses and its currency collapses, it can't defend. And then its nuclear deterrent collapses. And you just have to wait for the collapse of that nuclear deterrent, and it's game over. You've won. Because the French and the British and the Israeli and the Indian nuclear arsenals are too small to resist a big nuclear arsenal that is very efficient. The Russians, with their hypersonic missiles, can do a nuclear strike, or with an ICBM can do a nuclear strike and destroy preemptively the French, the British, except for the British and the French submarines that carry nukes. But those are relatively small problem. And if you have such a preponderance, such a weight, you can force these countries to surrender by your preponderance. That's the idea that they have. And also to use grain and oil as weapons. Notice how Biden pushed Saudi Arabia into the arms of China, right? So now the Gulf oil is going to go to who? The Gulf oil supplies Japan and Europe. If the Russians and Chinese can tell the Saudis to stop producing oil until the Europeans and the Japanese cooperate, Japan and Europe can't be allied with America. They have to be allied with whoever holds the oil, which would now be China through Saudi Arabia. So America loses its command of the Middle East. It loses its allies. All these countries want to be with the United States because the United States is a big sugar daddy for everybody. We've been protecting everybody for free. Well, they support our currency, the dollar, in exchange for that. It's a pretty cheap price, actually. And they don't have to build all these weapons and spend a huge amount on defense. They can have these big welfare states. But what happens now? If the United States gets knocked down, they have to all flip over to China and Russia. And that's kind of what the leveraging you're seeing now. With Macron going to China and coming back is, we don't need to be with America anymore. Let's just duck out of the America thing. I mean, this is what Macron said. And so he opened the door to that. And some Germans are saying, so if you can get all of Europe to say, yeah, it makes sense. We don't want the Americans here. New strategic architecture, Europe becomes under Russian dominance. And then Latin America under Russian and Chinese dominance, and Asia under China. So then what? America's all by itself then. That's the other scenario. The scenario that Lenin talked about is that we will spread communism and America will be the last capitalist dinosaur and we'll just choke it off.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, taking all of that into consideration and sort of summing up, what do you think is the likelihood, or perhaps the time frame, in case the likelihood is high, of a large-scale global conflict, military conflict in the upcoming years?
Well, you can always have things spiral out of control because look at World War I and World War II. Nobody who was making the decisions then thought it was going to do spiral in the way it did. I mean, Hitler did not want a general European war where he was having to fight all these countries. He was surrounded and in a desperate situation. He would have preferred to just take Poland, right? If he could have just gotten away with it, they would know they don't dare declare war on me. That was wishful thinking. Same thing in World War I. It was nobody. It was like a giant pedestrian accident. They all just started going to war with each other because mobilization is war, and one of them started mobilizing, and they all had to start mobilizing. And so, but the same kind of thing can happen here with nukes at any time. The law of unintended consequences. But insofar as the Russians and the Chinese are very deliberate in what they do, and they're very cautious and careful in what they do. They've got this mapped out, and of course, their map is kind of messed up now. They need to economically blackmail the West and defeat Ukraine, and then they can focus on America as the dominoes fall. And so looking at that is that as long as the war in Ukraine continues, they might try a nuclear attack on Poland with maybe 1 or 2 nukes. They might just to test, just to see and say, oops, whatever excuse they could claim, Pavel Stroilov is saying that there's this plan out of Moscow to have fake Ukrainian commandos take control of the nuclear weapons they're moving to Ukraine, fire them at Lithuania and or Poland, and as a kind of as a test. However that may be, they have to win Ukraine. They have to defeat Ukraine before they can graduate to a world war. Once Ukraine is defeated, the danger becomes very great because Europe will have a choice to either accept the new strategic architecture of Russia and stick with the U.S. or abandon the U.S. And if they stick with the U.S., world war will follow. They will have to start a world war. China and Russia will have to start one.
Yeah, because a 2+ front war is not very likely to end well for them, right?
No, it isn't. And so a nuclear blitzkrieg would have to come into, if they found themselves in that much danger, because there's always a danger when you're pushing the envelope, when you're trying to see, they're in the period of what they call one clenched fist, where China and Russia can operate openly together. And Golitsyn, the defector, wrote about this one clenched fist idea. And of course, this is a very dangerous time because we still have nuclear weapons. Nobody knows if they work properly because we haven't tested one in 30 plus years, since September 1992. But basically the idea is that they're dominant. They can push their dominance. They don't want a nuclear war. But their generals realize that, well, maybe you have to have one, because Clausewitz said, and Lenin and Marx believed in Clausewitz. This is what the good Russian generals, the ones that are smart, are saying is, all this deception stuff, all this trickery you're doing, it's not, in the end, you're going to have a war. You're going to have a very bloody, even nuclear. This was Marshal Sokolovsky, when they were inventing this strategy. He was saying, oh, all this trickery, all this NEP and fake, almost certainly he was saying, well, Clausewitz said this is a mistake. You're going to have a big war. Get ready for it. Accept it. If you have to wipe out 1 billion people, you have to wipe out 1 billion people. But then you own the world. And that's why they built up such large nuclear arsenals, by the way. That's in their mind. So what would I say? I would say we're okay as long as they're stuck in Ukraine. The minute they get past Ukraine, do a reassessment, we could be in grave danger, because China wanted to go to war in late 2020. And the Russians were saying we're not ready. From intelligence sources have told me this from various different directions. And they were telling this to some of their allies in 2020. China wants to have it over with because they've got this huge population they can't feed. And they're very worried about their economy collapsing, and their economy is starting to collapse with this problem in their urban real estate. China is facing economic catastrophe. And if they have that catastrophe, they might have a revolution. Their government would then be unable to but if they can focus on an outside enemy, they can unite China and have their cake and eat it too. So
yeah, I've also read some years ago some articles about the ecological situation in China, right?
They've destroyed their river system.
Yeah. So the need for territory and drinking water, and all that seems to be very urgent, right? So it's not only about it's not only about diplomatic domination and all that. It's also territory, right?
Yes. Yeah, it is. Chiao Chen, the former defense minister of China, gave this speech where he talked about China's degrading environment and how we need to make a second China in the lower 48 states. We need to exterminate the Americans with a biological attack and move half the population of China to North America. After all, he says in the speech, we discovered America before Columbus did. So it really should be ours. So this is what they're hoping to do. Of course, like I said about plans, these plans are likely to fall apart. They could find themselves boxed into a corner and start to execute it, and there could be a disastrous war. But can they win that war? Just like the situation in Ukraine, it's very hard to tell how countries will measure up, how peoples will measure up until they're under the gun and they have to fight for their survival. Then, then you find
Yeah,
out.
it doesn't sound very likely that's an operation like that, like the neutralizing of American defense capabilities, and then the transportation of millions of Chinese to American territory. Just it sounds very apocalyptical. It sounds very.
Yeah, they have the biggest. If you combine the Hong Kong merchant marine with the Chinese, they have the biggest merchant marine in the world. So they certainly have the sea lift capacity to do it.
Mm.
The question is can they actually, are their nuclear weapons accurate enough to win a first strike? And
Yeah, that's also something I would like to for you to comment a little more about, because what I've been told, at least what I've read, is that during the Cold War, one of the reasons that there wasn't that large scale nuclear conflict that people were fearing was that the balance was so tight that if Russia took the initiative, they could be wiped out. If America took the initiative, they would be wiped out. And I think many people believe nowadays that that's still the situation, right? So that Russia and China wouldn't dare start a nuclear conflict because they could be wiped out as well. But you comment, and you have been commenting about that for quite some time, that maybe American nuclear capacities aren't what we think. You could just expand on that.
Well, Peter Vincent Pry was sort of the nuclear warfighting expert. He passed away last year, but he wrote a book called Nuclear Wars, Exchanges and Outcomes. And certainly there was a point in the early 80s where the Russians were so far ahead of us in their nuclear weapons development that they could have won a nuclear war. In fact, Redmond Simonson and James Dunnigan of Simulations Publications in New York made a war game, giant war game for the Pentagon in the early 80s to war game World War III. And the first two times the Pentagon played the war game, the Soviet Union won World War III. First two times. In fact, a lot of the Reagan military reforms were to make it so that they could play that game and they could beat the Soviet Union. So things like putting ABMs, or essentially what are ABMs, anti-ballistic missiles, on cruisers, the Aegis class cruisers, to be able to shoot down Soviet missiles, to be able to properly defend our carriers, and to be able to actually win that kind of war. We had all kinds of technological upgrades in the 80s. And so that by the time you get to the mid-80s, the United States is winning these war games where they weren't previously. And this was, and the Russians actually there's a very curious story, which is the Able Archer exercises when the Soviet Union readied its forces for a first strike on the U.S., and the U.S. didn't catch it. I mean, they saw it happening, but the head of the Office of Soviet Analysis dropped the ball and didn't give the warning and said, oh, it's nothing, don't worry about it. But what actually happened was they were in a position, if they had started the war then, they would have won. And I was told this by somebody who worked in the Office of Soviet Analysis. They would have won. It was scary, but we don't know why. At least we didn't when I first heard the story. We don't know why they stopped. They didn't launch the war. Well, I got a KGB source that knew why they didn't launch the war. Andropov was in charge of the Soviet Union then, and he was sick, but the Soviet Union is ruled by the army, the party, and the KGB, and Andropov was KGB, and the army, they would have won World War III, but he thought that the army would be in a position to take over the party and wipe out the KGB. And he became paranoid and suspicious of the Soviet army, so he did not allow the war plan to go forward out of that suspicion. And that's why they didn't take their chance. It's interesting. Of course, a system based on paranoia and led by bad people, they have this basic issue of trust in their system.
It's incredible when you build an empire based on trickery and treason and lying, then that your empire starts malfunctioning, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why it sounds, from one point of view, it sounds hopeless what we're dealing with.
Mm.
But from this other point of view, when you look at all their problems and the things that they've run into the wall with, you go, wait a minute, it's it's not just one-sided. Our side isn't even in the game because we're so disoriented. Our thinking is so wrong. But we still have the structure of a coherent society. We have a survival instinct that we can go, wait a minute, they're trying to get us, and we will react. And they know that. That's why they don't come after us, because once they do come after us whole hog, then it's do or die. If they fail, we wipe them out because there's so many of us. So there's more normal people than psychopaths, even though in politics it looks very different than that.
Yeah, they're certainly louder, right?
Yeah, they are louder.
So another thing, now that we covered this strategic and military sides of it, now Olavo de Carvalho, who was certainly one of our greatest inspirations in building the institute and basically everything we've done recently, he used to talk about this sort of three-part scheme, right? Or sort of three globalist projects that, so three groups of people that had world domination ambitions, which was the Russian-Chinese bloc, right? Which aimed for some sort of political or military domination. We had Western globalism, which hoped for some kind of economic unification of the world. And then there was a third one, right, which was Islam, which was aiming for something like a spiritual domination of the world, a worldwide conversion to Islam. And then of course, their strategic wouldn't rely on military domination, which seems pretty obvious when we analyze the actual power balance of the West, the Russian-Chinese bloc, and Muslim countries, right? It doesn't look like a fair fight there. But it's a strange thing is, in the side of Western globalism, we have a very wide bibliography of people talking about the Bilderberg Group, the United Nations, all of that. From the Russian-Chinese side, we have all the defector literature, which you cite, but unfortunately, many people commenting on this issue seem to be unaware of the existence of that.
Oh, yeah.
And but it's there. It's there. We have Anatoliy Golitsyn. We have all the rest. We have your work. But from the Muslim side, it's I've read some years ago a book by a French journalist. I unfortunately cannot remember his name, talking about some connections that were found between the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic extremist movements, right, and also the terrorist organization, etc. But doesn't seem to reach something like the Islamic project as Olavo used to talk about. How do you think the Islamic project, so to say, if it even exists as what we would imagine a globalist project would be, how do you think it fits into this scale right now?
Well, the Islamic Brotherhood and the communist cells in Jordan, for example, formed a kind of alliance back in the 60s. So there's been a kind of clandestine alliance between the communists. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Between the communists and the extremist Islam, and Islam isn't totally united either. There is this problem. Islam could be a long-term problem when you have people converting to it. The real problem is the psychopathology of the West under liberalism. Islam is a simplistic kind of religion, which is the Islamic parts of the world are fairly stagnant compared to the West in terms of their development. This is somehow integral to Islam. Now, Iran might be an exception for special reasons having to do with that country, but the real problem is in the West. And what you described as the West is really liberalism, right? And liberalism is it's an economically focused. Man is a homo economicus, and all you need is you have individual rights, and you have republican government or mixed monarchy, whatever, and then of course you have this wonderful system of checks and balances that works so wonderfully, and people have freedom. Well, there's a missing element here. What we found is that liberalism becomes plutocracy. Plutocracy is ruled by the rich. So, and there's a problem with that, because traditional human society has had aristocracy, not plutocracy. And aristocracy is a warrior aristocracy has, in the West particularly, the code of chivalry, and it's integrated with Christianity, and it's a moral code and a warrior code, and it's a code for leading society, and it's the harmony of the orders, all the ideas that the West has had. But with plutocracy and equality, democratic equality, that's all gets leveled. And what you have is a society that does not have a defensive function. It can't defend itself from enemies, subversive enemies from within or from enemies without. It is not, because it's what they've done is they've thrown out the warrior ethic and replaced it with the billionaire's ethic, getting rich. And this is a real problem. I mean, the bourgeoisie was a class that existed underneath the warrior aristocracy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the workers and the peasants, you had the bourgeoisie, you had the aristocracy. You've just wiped all that out, and you've gone straight to the bottom and say, well, we're just going to elect somebody. So we're going to get Joe Biden, right? The workers kind of guy. That is the inversion of the whole idea of leadership of society. And it turns out that the bourgeoisie, the wealthy people in the world, they're monomaniacs about their business. They're great at making money. It's great to have prosperity, but they don't understand war and politics, and they don't understand subversion. So they end up getting sucked into relationships with Muslims or with communists, and they open the border and the Muslims stream in, or they have the communism takes them over. Mao called it the yin and way. Why sew up their pockets? Help the capitalists get rich. We'll take over. Mao actually was giving lectures on this in the 30s and the 40s. I mean, it's just common sense. But when you talk to businessmen, it's like, oh, they're not serious. They don't want to take over anything. We'll just give them money and they'll be happy. No, because to see the world as, Mao said, political power flows out of the barrel of a gun. And all these billionaires say, no, power is money. Okay, Mao says, you have all the money and I'll have all the guns. Then stick them up. I have all the money and all the guns now. See, that's the game the way the communist revolutionaries see it. And they see it very clearly. They see this element of it very clearly. The problem is the businessmen don't. Oh, they would never do that. Oh, we're in business with them. Oh, we're going to make money together. A rising tide lifts all boats. No, they're going to sink yours. And then they're going to own the ocean. This is a basic misunderstanding. There's a problem with Western society in that when we destroyed the aristocratic class and we went for egalitarian democracy, when that French Revolution thing percolated through the whole, we were opened up to the left, to ever moving leftward within our system. And we were then headed for, well, why do we need weapons? Nobody's going to attack us. They want to be rich. They want shopping malls. We'll just build shopping malls and they'll want them. Why would they attack us? We're giving them a great way of life. It's Nixon in the kitchen debate with Khrushchev is like, look at all these great refrigerators and things. You can have them in Russia. We're going to win. That was Eisenhower's idea. We're going to win by living better than the Soviets. No, but you see, the people that have always dominated in history were stoical people. And aristocracy is a warrior aristocracy. Their main ethic is stoicism. It's not hedonism or Epicureanism. And so the Epicurean, this is the problem with, if you read Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, he wrote a book before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And the book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, don't read, he changed it in the early 1890s because he saw the problem with what he did in the 1790s. He saw the problem with what he did in 1757 when he wrote the original book. If you read the book, he says there's two basic ethics in human beings. There's the Epicurean and there's the Stoical. This is what he says in the book. Now, this gets changed later on. And he says, you know what's the matter with the world is the Stoics have always, the aristocrats, have always been in charge. And they're pretty sadistic. You know, they're into pain and they're into war. And the American Indian is a warrior aristocrat, right? He's into pain. He likes to torture. He likes to show that he can withstand torture. And it's like, what if we had an Epicurean republic or an Epicurean commonwealth? Everybody lives better, and maybe we get rid of war. We get rid of the whole instinct of war. I mean, he actually suggests this in this 1857 version of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, is that we could have an Epicurean republic and everybody could live. And this is largely, this experiment, this book is actually more important than The Wealth of Nations. Because this is what we really did. We created, America's the great Epicurean republic. And the more we got away from the aristocratic stoical ethic, the more we were just in it for feeling good, until finally we treat even philosophical issues as if, well, we determine what's true based on what feels good. The hedonistic, because Epicureanism, as Cicero said, Epicureanism inevitably devolves into hedonism. You know, which is, I think it's the ultimate. They saw this in the late Roman Republic. They saw how that worked because they were confronting these issues at that time, what we're going through now. So this was an experiment to make an Epicurean republic. And they have, look, Canada and the U.S. get along. There's no chance of war between Canada and the U.S., the two Epicurean commonwealths right next to each other. But the problem is the human instinct for war and for power is still going to be percolating under everything. And this is what Vilfredo Pareto points out in his Mind and Society. He says, you can only bribe the barbarians so long before they just take your money and attack you anyway. Because
and in a broader perspective also, this hedonistic culture leaves a spiritual vacuum.
It is an absolute, because it's materialistic, it's materialism. It becomes atheism, and it has no spiritual content. It turns out that war is a part of the human condition and part of what we have to experience here on this earth. God so made the world that all of these elements are things we are part of human experience in life, and they are not going to change. There is this, the way things are is the way they are. And even with all of our technological innovation, all right, well, we got the atomic bomb now. You think they're not going to use it? They've used every other weapon. Well, we already have used it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It will be used again. Because, and then people say, oh, you know, with the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama, you know, if we had truth police, he would be in jail. Because then he knew he was lying. Francis Fukuyama knew he was lying. And it comes out at the end of his book where he says, well, he basically says Nietzsche talks about the last man. And the last man is this Epicurean man, right? Who lives in this comfortable world. We're like insects and we hoppeth, you know. We are the last men. We know how to be healthy. We know how to live longer. We know how to have a more pleasant life. And pleasant poison, you know, now and then for a pleasant death in the end, etc. You know, Nietzsche writes about this last man. And Francis Fukuyama says, well, I just don't want to believe in that. I want to have it. I want to be a last man is basically what Francis Fukuyama says. I want to be a last man. So I believe the end of the Cold War. I believe in the end of history. I believe we've reached this kind of liberal paradise, right? And it was all just lies. Because the last man just sets up the biggest war and calamity of all. He is a calamity, as Nietzsche points out. The last man is the calamity. And he's the last man because there's nothing after him. He's a nihilist. It's nihilism. And so it sets up the ultimate war, is my argument. The final war. It's not final. You know, that's why I call my book The Origins of the Fourth World War. there'll be a first, second, third, fourth, fifth, as high as you can count. We're just going to keep having them, right? Because that's human nature. It's built into us. The enemy, the friend-enemy distinction is always going to be present. And otherwise, you have the last man? Really? Better to accept that humans will fight each other than to accept this homogenized, mealy-mouthed, horrific creature that has nothing, there's nothing worth fighting for or dying for. It's just, I want my stuff and I want to live really comfortably. It's horrible. There's no moral center to this creature. Because what people ultimately fight over, it's not true that the history of warfare is class struggle. There are values, there is morality, there is philosophical issues. Where is human society going next? And that's always going to be there. You know, are we going to have the Third Reich? Are we going to have the American Republic? Are we going to have something new that comes out of Brazil? Are we going to have something new out of Europe or Asia? What are we going to have next? How are we going to resolve it? It's always going to be a fight. My values versus yours, them and us. The politics is defined by the friend-enemy distinction. That's what politics is. If there's no friend-enemy distinction, there's no politics, and there's no war. There's no statesmanship. There's no need for government. We all just get along.
Right. Now, we experienced in the last 2-3 years the whole COVID situation, right? And I congratulate you in being such an early whistleblower, let's say, about the potential role that China played in that, and I mean an intentional role. And as far from reading your stuff and also other people, what I understand right now is that the most likely thesis is that this whole situation is started as an initiative of China, probably as a way of
yes,
destabilizing the West.
Yep.
And but it was picked up by Western governments, right? It was picked up by the globalist elite as a way of also furthering their control over the population. So it looks like it was sort of an alliance, or perhaps a way the globalists profited from a crisis.
Well, the globalists are so infiltrated by the communists. It's hard to know where the one begins and the other ends. Because the thing about liberalism is completely clueless about communism. And so they will align with the communists and become manipulated by them. I mean, look at Bill Gates. They have so won him over. He's a virtual agent of China. So the problem with the capitalist class is, since they don't have a backbone, since they're Gumby and they're completely flexible and they just want to make money, like Mao said, all we have to do is why sew up their pockets. We'll make them rich and they'll give us all the power and we'll control everything. Then we'll shoot them all at the end. So I think the Chinese had a weapon. I think they had a biological weapon. And it was supposed to work better than it did. I think what happened is it mutated to a less harmful version very quickly. Because when you make a chimera virus, it mutates rapidly towards the common cold, like what I've got now. That's what it becomes. Maybe what I have is COVID, but it's just a cold, right? So that's what it does. It mutates back. What they probably didn't know was how fast it mutated back. So it killed a lot of people at first and scared people. And then they kept the scare going. They amplified the numbers and they had these bad policies. And then they tried to introduce the vaccine solution. My fear is the vaccine solution is a experiment by the Chinese. The Chinese have gotten in with big pharma. And there's evidence that the first Pfizer factory to make the vaccine for Pfizer was in Shanghai, although they hid all that. So the Chinese, so you get a pandemic where everybody's going to mandate everybody to have a vaccine. And then all of a sudden, the vaccine's made in China. Well, if the Chinese want to kill the Americans, or they want to kill the West, America and Europe, and there's something that's going into the arm of every person, there's your kill shot. You give them something that kills them in 2-3 years. Or in the case of what's really scary about, there's been vaccine deaths. There's evidence, Dowd's book about it died suddenly. But that's really still a small number of people. What's really scary is the number of miscarriages and the inability of women to get pregnant. Have they affected our birth rate significantly so that there may not be another generation of any significant size to defend us, so that you go 30 years down the road and we're a dying society because this vaccine sterilized effectively so many people? That's one thought. If this is an experiment and they're just seeing if they can get a thing in everybody's arm, will they push this experiment? Because the people pushing the vaccine were the usual suspects for the most part. They were the people in pharma and in government that were oftentimes linked with the left and with China, and had these relationships. So General Chiao Chen said we have to kill 100 to 200 million Americans with a bio attack. And of course, they want to create a civil war here. What's the perfect thing? You have a vaccine that supposedly we've made, although covertly it's been made in China. I mean, we find out this later that the Pfizer, what about Moderna? What about some future date? They won't tell us anything. It's very suspicious about the vaccine and where it's made or how it's made. They were not opaque at all. You get some future pandemic and they get that needle in everybody's arm and they kill off, let's say they can't put it in everyone. Let's say they kill off half the population. Do you have a civil war? Or is the collapse so severe that they just take you over? Because you don't have enough people to run your infrastructure, right? So a bio attack. And I'm thinking out of the box. Admittedly, I can't prove what didn't happen because it's all so filled up with these narratives, true and false. Try to sort them out. But it's you have to think in terms of strategy. You've got to look at it like a strategist if you want to be safe, if you want to understand attack and defense. This is the kind of, I think, biological attack of the future. Start a pandemic, infiltrate the enemy's pharmaceutical industry, put poison in the medicine or the vaccine, and cause mass death that way. That's more effective, I think, than any biological weapon, because I think biological weapons are essentially, in terms of mass casualty events, they're not effective enough. They just aren't. The human immune system is a miracle and can adapt. You create a chimera virus, and young people are going to be amazingly. Look at how children were not affected by this disease. It's amazing.
Yeah, and besides the biological component, one thing I would like to talk about is the sort of the psychological component, because it was not just a health crisis, but it was sort of a psychological crisis in the sense that the readiness of people to accept absurd, completely illogical measures from their governments in every level was absolutely astounding. And perhaps from these globalist/communist elites, it looked like perhaps even new possibilities were opened, because I don't know if they expected that people would be so incredibly naive and gullible to the point of, like here, for example, we had, in the beginning of the pandemic, we had this trope that, okay, so people can't gather because gathering promotes the spread of the virus. And then one of the first measures that the governments in every level took was to limit the opening time of commercial establishments. So stores and restaurants, they could only open in a limited time. So people cannot gather. So now they have fewer times of the day available to shop. So how is that going to combat gathering? Isn't that going to promote gathering? But then it just went by, and then we lived under that sanitary dictatorship for basically 2 years. And now, do you think since people have proven so gullible and so willing to accept these measures, and also since you've written those two very interesting articles called Speculative Despair and the Extraterrestrial Apocalypse, something like that. It's a 2-part article. Do you think there are perhaps other mass hysteria operations coming?
Oh yeah,
Similar to
I
that?
think they're still, our enemies have learned a great deal from it. But you look, one good example here is Sweden. And this is where reason comes in. Sweden didn't do any of these lockdowns, right? And their death rate wasn't was lower than per capita than the US death rate. And the US had lockdowns. So in other words, the lockdown thing doesn't work. It didn't work. But yet you don't hear everybody saying, oh, gee, next time we're going to do what Sweden did. In fact, the whole way of reacting to pandemics was kind of invented and based on the China model. We adopted, the world adopted this China model, except for Sweden. And the thing is that you can't stop a communicable disease from being communicated. You can shelter in voluntary sheltering. The elder population stayed away. I had Swedish friends. Their parents stayed away from the kids. The kids went to school. Everything was run as normal. People wore masks. They did it voluntarily. Everything was normal. They didn't suffer anything worse than any other society under the pandemic. But yet the economic effects on the United States, on Britain, the damage to the economy, the damage to businesses was just extraordinary. And what was it? Remember what I said about Stalin saying that the real enemy is the small business. Who got destroyed in this pandemic? Small businesses. That empowered who? It empowered the elite of the big businesses and the big everything that have more control. And from psychological warfare point of view, look, bureaucracy is terrible as plutocracy. Bureaucrats are they're again the warrior aristocratic ethic and actual ethical behavior. Bureaucratic managers turn out to be rather horrible people who can be bribed and who can actually promote things that are harmful to the public benefit. I mean, Fauci's a good example. There's been a number of books about him, about the AIDS epidemic. How many people is he responsible for having killed? How much economic misery has he spread? You can have an economic collapse in a country that's worse than the effects of the pandemic. Let's say the pandemic could kill 1 million or 2 million people in Brazil. If you have an economic collapse and a civil war, more people than that could easily die. You have the Mexican Civil War of more than 100 years ago, and some people think as many as a third of the population of Mexico died. You know, imagine that in Brazil, you'd have 60 million people dying. You know, so it's like the bad judgment. But you see, the people at the top aren't thinking very rationally. Our plutocrats don't think very well. They're very shallow. They understand their businesses, but these complex political issues, they don't understand. And our bureaucrats think in their provincial bureaucratic, right, their little turf, how can I expand my part of it? How can I get more people under me? How can I get a bigger budget? And that's not solving anything. And so you have no leadership. And so you have this open thing for hysteria to develop and for these false narratives to develop that can corral or herd people. Look, we need to get everyone vaccinated right away, or we need to take this pill. Where is it coming from? Oh, from China. Oh, no, it's not coming from China. Oh, yes, it is. No, it's not. We swear we made it and it's safe. You're going to take it, see? And then you can herd people into a situation where you can do what Hitler did in the extermination camps and make a whole country into an extermination camp where you can literally erase most of an entire population, change the demographics of planet Earth, you know, kill off the population of sub-Saharan Africa or Europe or North America, you know, and then own the world, repopulate it with Chinese or Russians or whatever you want to do. Because totalitarian thinking envisions, plutocrats are actually liberal. They don't really think about mass exterminating people, but the leaders in China and Russia, they've already done it. Their bureaucratic machines of Hitler and Stalin and Mao, they killed more than 100 million people in the 20th century. And they would have killed more except for not having the means or opportunity. The 21st century now, with this kind of scenario, you got means and opportunity galore. You can now change the racial makeup of humanity by using these mass destruction, mass killing techniques that this pandemic might have been pioneered for. It's possible. Somebody's thinking these thoughts. It's not just me thinking these thoughts. Bad guys are thinking these thoughts. I'm thinking these thoughts prophylactically. What are the bad guys going to do next?
Right. So, as far as I understand, the most likely sequels to that would be some other kind of health crisis, something related to that, or you think it's in another front?
Another pandemic? It's hard to say. You've got absolutely bizarre hysteria that could exist over, extraterrestrial contact, a meteor hitting the Earth. There's all kinds of different scenarios where we have to unite humanity, and we have to, and then you get over on people, and you change the way constitutions work and the way liberty works, the way economies work, and pretty soon people find themselves, they're enslaved, and they don't understand what did it to them. The people that, the plutocrats in the West have become collaborators with the party mob in the East, the Chinese especially. And this is extremely negative because the Chinese are always going to get the advantage over the capitalists, even though a lot of people think it's the other way around. The capitalists can wake up and go, wait a minute, the Chinese are hurting us. We have to put the kibosh on them. But they never fully wake up because their greed reactivates them again. Right? You can't cheat an honest man, and they're not entirely honest. So they constantly wanting to go back into business with the totalitarians. The totalitarians will try to cheat them and ultimately kill them. Like Mao said, why sew up their pockets? You guys can make all the money. Give us the guns. And then it's the stick 'em up time. And we're getting close to the stick 'em up because look, the supposedly the United States is a plutocracy run by all the rich people basically put their money in the elections and decide who's going to run everything. Well, the thing is why haven't the rich people want a nuclear arsenal to protect their homeland? Why is Bill Gates worried about vaccinations and pandemics? Why isn't he worried about being nuked by China and or Russia? Why doesn't he want bomb shelters? Why doesn't he want civil defense protection? Why doesn't he want to have nuclear weapons that are guaranteed to work in the U.S.? When our nuclear arsenal has passed its shelf life, and some scientists tell me they don't think they work. We haven't tested one since September 92. So that's if our plutocrats actually had a brain for politics and for war and strategy, this is what they'd be thinking. Oh no, Congress has to build a new nuclear. No, we're not going to have a new nuclear warhead till 2029, and maybe that'll be killed between now and then. The communists are just better strategists. They have their eye on the ball. The capitalists, they think, oh no, all that strategy doesn't matter. We're just going to make money. And they're going to want our cash. They need us. They need us. They wouldn't attack us. It's just like the story of the camel and the scorpion in the Middle East. They need to cross a river. The scorpion needs to cross a river. And the scorpion says, look, I can ride on your back. You can swim across and we can get across that river. And the camel says, well, you'll sting me halfway across and we'll both drown. And the scorpion said, no, I won't do that. I don't want to drown. I won't sting you. They get in the middle of the river and the scorpion stings the camel. And the camel said, now you stung me. We're in the middle of the river. We're both going to drown. And the scorpion says, why did you do that? And the scorpion says, well, I'm a scorpion. That's what I do. And that's really why you say, why is it going to happen? Because it's in the nature of things that this is how they act. This is how China acts. This is how they are. It's important to understand the leaders of the totalitarian countries basically have a criminal psychology. They're psychopaths. And there was a book written by a group of Polish psychologists called Political Ponerology. And and they were studying the Polish, right, Lobachevsky. They were looking at the situation in Poland, the leaders. It first occurred to them they went to a lecture of a new person. They were orienting the university towards the new communist system, and they said, Did you notice the guy lecturing to us had traits of a psychopath? And they started thinking, do the other people chosen by this regime have those traits? So they did a 20-something year study of the regime to see if the regime was promoting psychopaths or other abnormal personalities. And sure enough, they found that it did. And that's Putin is an abnormal personality. Probably most of the leaders, maybe Sergei Shoigu is not, but most of the personalities at the top of the Russian system are. I even had a Russian defector tell me, these are not normal people. These are not human beings. These are crazy persons, he said to me.
Yeah, I've read recently about, I don't know, of course, if it's true, because in the war, many narratives emerge, but I've read that in some recent operations in the Ukraine war, the Russians have resorted to suicide squads, tactics. So you want to attack and then create a diversion, which is just a group of people who send there to just die, to be massacred. Right?
Yeah, they do. It's called loss. They use loss leaders. They go out there to draw fire so that they can then counter battery where the fire is coming from. So they're just sacrificing. They have to send enough people forward to justify the enemy to hit them with an artillery. Then they counter battery the artillery. This is horrific. And one of the reasons why the Russian system is so corrupt and why it doesn't work is that since psychopaths and thieves, basic criminal types, run everything, they're always stealing and they're always stepping on the people underneath them. And so the people underneath them have they're not motivated to really do their jobs. So the whole thing is inefficient. It doesn't really work. And, this is why Ukraine is a free country. They had their revolution. The people are motivated. They want to fight. Their leaders want to help the people be free. I remember one Ukrainian guy told me, he said, we in the Ukrainian intelligence services, we had a choice. We could stay with Moscow or we could go with Ukrainian people. And we decided to go with Ukrainian people. And look at what a difference it made. You actually had a big chunk, second biggest chunk of the Soviet Union, break away. And it's basically a Soviet civil war is what they're fighting. Which should give us all hope, because evil just is evil. And it doesn't really prevail in the end. It may seem to. It may seem to have all the advantages. But the truth is the truth. And right and wrong are what they are. And those are eternal things. They're eternal.
Right. Now, our institute started as a group of people studying the works of Olavo and his online philosophy course. But with time, we realized that there was a problem when we tried to study philosophy and also to sort of try to teach others, right? Because people didn't seem to be able to understand even some basic concepts or deal with some lightly abstract ideas. So investigating this issue more, we found out that the root of this inability for us to understand ourselves was in literacy, right? So people went to schools, they went to university, and they were never really taught to read. And so there was, investigating this issue, we discovered that there had been a severe decline in literary education in Brazil. And basically, if people go to our website, they'll find out that even though we talk about a lot of things, we're hosting this interview about geopolitics, but our main focus now is on restoring classical education and literary education. Now, you commented on this decline of American culture, Western culture in general, and just how even though the Russia-Chinese bloc have this problem with their own malfunctions due to lies and deception and trickery and how their system is so corrupt, but we are not much better than that, because the West is going crazy in a very, very rapid rate. Now, how do you see the connection there? Especially in America, or perhaps if you're informed about the situation in the West in general, between the debacle in education, perhaps more specifically in literary education, and this dumbing down, this stupidification of the West?
It is integral to communist education. I assume it's the same in Brazil. I've heard that it is. most of the curriculum in most of the schools in the United States, the public schools, that curriculum was actually devised in the Soviet Union. And it was devised to, I think, intentionally to destroy certain cognitive ability and to teach certain things that they wanted.
But that was applied in Russia as well?
Yes, they did. Unfortunately, in Russia, the real Russian education system does not rely on the public schools. It revolves around private tutoring.
Mm.
And since they had a black market economy and everything, one of the big black market economies was people who had skills teaching other people directly. So there's this tremendous culture in Russia of private teaching and tutoring. Now, just like in the United States, the common person's education level in Russia is they got the same problems with their education system. With a lot of their, working class people, they have the same kind of problems. And in the United States, there's a lady. Her name is Robin Eubanks. She wrote a book called "Educated to Destroy," and she made this discovery that everything really came from the Soviet Union. Our top educationists in the 70s went to the Soviet Union and brought these programs back with them and Americanized them, implemented them. And the most interesting thing is that the Russian documents that explain why it's designed the way it is were never translated into English. So we don't know what they say. They were never given to us. So the rationale for that is it's a communist rationale. And of course, predictably, when you see what it does, she makes the argument, and I think she's right, is that the educational system is meant to lower the cognitive ability, lower the ability to think, and to confuse the mind, to cloud the mind, to make things unclear. And people who are not able to think for themselves are more easily led. And this is what these systems want. They want to use mass media to control the public. You look, what do you need to do to push a broom or to work in a factory, whatever? You don't need that advanced education. We can give that to the specialists. But the masses, the lower the level, the better, right? Mm-hmm. You don't need to be bettering. Besides, people get culture. They get these ideas that are against totalitarian thinking. Mm-hmm. So, like you say, classical education. All of the great, you go back to the ancient Greeks who stood up for freedom against the Persian Empire. Famous story. You go to the Romans. The Roman Republic was about freedom. Great story. You have the rise of chivalry in Europe. Great stories. So you learn this and this rich history. And then you're not susceptible to these slogans and these cheap, very boring, by the way, political narratives about, the poor and the blacks and the cripples and the people who are disadvantaged, and we have to make everybody equal. It's urgent, as if anybody ever could be made equal, as if it's even that good of an idea, as if you could actually do it. So in order to make everyone equal, we would have to have power over. You'd have to give me power. Okay, I'm going to make everyone equal. You got to give me power over everyone. That's the game. Mm-hmm. And so it's just creating this incredible tyranny to make everyone equal. That's all it amounts to. It's a trick, because people aren't equal. Outcomes aren't equal. The world is not fair. Get used to it. We are all going to die. Is that fair? I don't know. It's just the way it is. And God has made it this way for a reason, because eternity isn't here. The truth is not, it's elusive here, but there is this higher, there's transcendence. And so that's what we're really supposed to be understanding from this, is like, yeah, it's unfair. Yeah, there's all this evil in the world. Yeah, but we're here for a reason. We're here to learn.
Do you see perhaps an upcoming shift in the mentality of young people in the West towards these more sane ideas?
It's because of the education system. It's very bad. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But people like yourself, people who are searching for the truth, that have learned the old standards, have learned the classics and can read, you're in touch with this great tradition. And if people see what you have and want it for themselves, they'll try to get it. The reason that classical education developed was that people wanted to have that. They wanted to learn Greek or Latin. They wanted to be able to read the classics because it distinguished the mind. It gave you the ability to think, and it gave you enlarged understandings because the ancients had developed those understandings, and now you can have them. Who wouldn't want that to enrich their life? And it is incredibly enriching in the life, as opposed to these modern, desiccated, boring ideologies that are just going to help some psychopath establish his power over everybody else. So I think the problem is people are going to have to learn the hard way. And I think what happened is that when mayhem comes, when things start to fall apart, there will come a moment when people go, oh, I want that kind of leader. I want this noble guy over here. I want these people who know about the ancient Greeks and Romans here. I want these guys that have a deeper thought process because I think we need to think things through more, and that's what I want in a leader. So I think that it comes that naturally society will reach the point where nature will take hold and the best will rise. Right now we've got an inverted system where the scum rises to the top and the best people are held back because you don't want them. They'll rock the boat. They'll prevent everything from going forward. So you've got an inverted value system, and it's quite clear this inversion, and it's sort of satanic, this inverted value system, both in the way people behave, but in the kind of leaders they pick. We had an election here in the Republican primary. We had somebody, we had a surgeon, the black surgeon, Ben Carson, running, such an excellent man who's written a book on the Constitution and is highly literate. His mother made him and his brother read from the time they were very young. Read a book a week. Read a serious book a week or more. And that man has a distinguished mind, Ben Carson. I listen to him and I go, my gosh, all those idiots up there running for president. And this guy is a gem. And it's like, no, he didn't last a minute. They picked Trump, right? So it's like there's an inversion where the best are not picked. And they're just insulted. People don't know respect. So they don't give respect. They don't respect themselves. And they don't have any real values. It's very nihilistic. And this has overcome the West, by the way. The only reason that the Russians and the Chinese and the communists and these other people even have a chance is this collapse of values and this collapse of philosophy and understanding, which has happened, which is extremely serious. And as far as literacy, look, the average American 170 years ago was more literate than a college-educated person today. Most of our college-educated people really aren't literate either anymore. They get out of college, they never read a book. Yeah.
Now, talking about that, I've been a fan of yours for a long time now. And to be honest, not only because of the accuracy of your knowledge and your predictions about geopolitics, etc., but also because of your style. To be honest, I very much appreciate the way you write, and the way you write seems to me as evidence that you are also a fairly well-read person, right? You have read your classics. Now, just on a more personal level, do you have any top picks, any favorites in English literature or world literature?
Well, I have to admit, I had a love affair with Cicero when I was in my 20s. And Cicero is, a lot of people don't like him. They think it's boring or whatever, but Cicero was the man who was seeking for an elegant way of persuading people. And he wanted to do it, at least in principle. He wanted to advance the good cause. And his story is very interesting. There's a 3-volume series on the life of Cicero. It's a novelization, which is a recreation of the lost biography of Cicero written by his private secretary, who invented shorthand, by the way. And it's really incredibly brilliant because it follows history exactly. But I saw when I was young in the 80s the story of the fall of the Roman Republic and the life of Cicero and the works of Cicero. I saw a distant mirror of our time as an American living in a republic, in the next great republic after Rome. And it very much moved me to know as much about this Republic of Rome and how it came apart and what the lessons were. And Cicero was a big part of that in his writings and his life story. So that was very big to me. But the other surprising discovery was I enjoyed Herodotus, but Thucydides, who you have to read again and again, and who Tacitus based his writings on imitating him, a Latin version of it. There is such incredible depth in Thucydides as a historian.
Yeah.
I am in agreement with Macaulay that there may not ever be a historian as great as Thucydides. He may be the greatest. And I remember in graduate school encountering people saying, "Oh, well, that's kind of interesting for what it is, but It's like I couldn't understand how they could turn their nose up at it because of the depth of it. The ability to take an event, the depth of Thucydides. He would look at something and turn it over and over, and he would see it. He looked with such great, incredible care, because there's a superficial way of looking at something where you just kind of see it, say, yeah, but you're not really looking. And this is where the philosopher Nietzsche said something about German education, which is brilliant. He said that real education consists of learning first how to see. You have to learn how to see. And he also said you have to learn how to resist a stimulus, right? That is, resist coming to a conclusion about what you first see. Because your first impulse is to come to the wrong conclusion. Learning then how to read, and then how to think and to write and to speak yourself. And that's really it. And it boils down at first to just being able to see. And Thucydides was a guy who saw with this kind of objectivity and this kind of depth. And then his writing reflected that. That his paragraphs are so dense and so filled with, he doesn't waste words. So that when you go to
the way he uses the Greek language is absolutely baffling for people who get the opportunity of reading him in Greek.
Yes, there's people who have learned Greek just to read him in the Greek. And when you switch over to Xenophon, Thucydides died before he finished the history, and Xenophon, the Greek general, the Athenian general, took over. And it's like, after having this incredible fare from Thucydides to go to Xenophon, it's like, oh, and it's nothing against Xenophon. I enjoy him. His book his book on Socrates is a delight, but it's just not the same.
Yeah, it's not Thucydides.
No. And you see in Tacitus some of this in the Annals of Imperial. We of course we don't have the whole many of it is lost, a lot of it is fragmentary. And the Germanicus, so much so that when you read Tacitus, there are so many things to reflect on that apply to us today. So and the other thing about antiquity that I would say, that it was very important. Just think, I went to college in the 70s, graduated college in 81, and it was a very ideological period. And this Marxism and all the rest of it was just bored down on your intellect. It just weighed everything down. And to escape into antiquity, where all of these narratives and all of this ideological nonsense isn't there. They're not ideological in the same sense that we are. It's like stepping into a different world where it's pure You can now observe without all that garbage, having to see it through capitalism or communism or all these other isms. You're actually able to see more clearly. And it was just, and it's like going to an alien world, only they're all human beings. So the thing that we have in common with them is still there. And so you get to know man. You get to know history. So you're not going to have a Francis Fukuyama moment where you say, oh, it's the end of history. You know, what would Thucydides or Herodotus say? Oh, no, it's not going to end. It just keeps going. This is exciting. It's interesting. Why do you want it to end with the last man, after all? So that we can just be comfortable and get to be 300, 600 pounds, and they can bury us all in piano boxes. We're so happy and so fat. It's ridiculous. It really is. But the ancients, they had this spirit to them that was different. And so to understand the modern world, you can't understand it unless you've stepped outside of it into antiquity and looked at it from that. Then you can start to see yourself, our own time, more objectively.
Right.
And you see people say, oh, you just think the Americans are good and the Soviets are bad, or the Russians are bad, or the communists are bad. No, we're all bad. Let's get that straight. We're all bad, and we're all. It's who's going to collapse into a puddle of muck first, right? Who's going to melt into a puddle of muck first? It's really, modernity is nihilistic and disintegrating. It's all disintegrative, and it's because we've fallen out of balance. When I read great historians or sociologists, the more modern ones, they all are anchored. All the moderns who are worth reading were anchored in the ancient world. And that, like Jacob Burckhardt, the cultural historian, the Swiss cultural historian, he had this brilliant thing that was in his notes that he said, well, you know, civilization consists of three things. It's culture, it's the church, and the state. And these three things have to be in balance. If one of these things is too strong, it will tyrannize and destroy the function of the others. It needs the church for the spiritualizing function. It needs the state for the defensive function. And it needs the culture to make things, to make wealth and to art and all the rest of it. Well, what happens if the church becomes tyrannical and tramples down the other? The spiritualizing function is corrupted, and the other functions of the state in the culture are corrupted. What happens if the state becomes, like in a totalitarian state, well, then it corrupts the culture and it corrupts the religion, like you have in Russia, where the state is everything. And then, but see, here's the American fault. The culture is everything. And the state has been corrupted. So the state doesn't defend. The state is just an extension of the culture. And the church has become the Jesus business, right? So the spiritualizing function has been corrupted by the desire to make money. So this very simple schema that Burckhardt had, which is, it's a reductionistic, so you don't want to take it too serious, but there's these insights into it. And you take that and you combine it with Pareto and the insights from all these other and you find out they're all saying the same thing about why we're disintegrating. They're all just looking at it from a different angle. So that when Pareto comes and he talks about, Pareto talks about the circulation of elites and the lions and the foxes. And he says that when a civilization is young, the lions are predominant. But when it gets old and corrupt, the foxes are predominant. And they do everything by negotiating and lying and deceiving and tricking. And they lose the ability to fight. They just want to negotiate everything. They won't confront. And so they want to bribe the barbarians at the end of the Roman Empire. And they end up getting taken over. Well, that's where we are again, too. That's another way of describing the culture becoming ascendant over state and church. They're not really spiritual. They don't want to fight and perform the defense function. So there it is again. So whatever literature we go to, the great minds are saying the same thing in a different way. They're just giving you a different angle on it. And that's what, and again, it all comes from classical education. It does. And then you understand we are disintegrating. We don't have aristocracy. We don't have a balance between the three elements. We're ruled by foxes instead of lions. Nobody wants to confront. The last man is here. We just want to get fat, and whoever dies with the most toys wins. All that. It's all rotten, right?
Mhm.
But it will. But what they all say is that it's cyclical and it will correct itself. It will flip over. We will get through this. It might be terrible, because history is both beautiful and terrible.
Mhm.
And this is God's way. It's the way the world was made to work.
Right. Now, perhaps I have abused your patience, especially you being ill, because we are almost at 3 hours, at the 3 hour mark here. Of course, if it were according to my will, we would be talking for 10 hours, but I don't want to cause you any more tiredness. So, Mr. Nyquist, thank you very much for agreeing on coming on our channel. I will put the links below in the description for your books, for your blog, and even for the sources of some things that you said that perhaps people think, oh no, he's just inventing these things. No, he's not. No, he's not. He's been doing this for a long time, and he's done his homework, certainly. Okay, so that's it then. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, and stay in touch. Let's do this again.
We will certainly.
All right.
So, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.